Hi, it's author Dean M. Cole. Your audiobook's going to start in just a few seconds. This is the R.C. Bray versions of the Sector 64 series. So if you've already listened to Mike Ortego's version of the series, you may want to skip this one. Otherwise, enjoy. I think you're going to love it. If you want to listen to these commercial-free, there's discounted purchase links where you can get them for 30% less than what you'd pay on Audible, and you buy them directly from me. So that helps me out and helps you out. I've broken this audiobook into 3 parts so that each is about 4 hours long. This is part 1. When you get to the end, there's going to be a link. I'll also drop a link in the comments, and you can just go right into the next part. And then, so that'll be part 2 of 3 and then 3 of 3. Anyway, that's it. Thanks again. And if you've already started the Ortego versions and you want to finish those links are also in the comments. Anyway, thanks. Enjoy.
Blue Heron Audio presents Ambush, Sector 64, Book 1, by Dean M. Cole. Read by R.C. Bray. Part 1. We stand now at the turning point between 2 eras. Behind us is a past to which we can never return. Arthur C. Clarke. 2 fighter jets sliced through the night air. A crescent moon, thin as an orange peel, cast a dim glow across the Nevada desert 5,000 feet below the F-22s. Even under the waning crescent, the bright desert reminded Jake of a spaghetti western's night scene. As if filmed during the day with a dark filter to simulate night, the excess visual details seemed out of temporal place. Papa 2-1, this is Lima 2-4, over. Air Force Captain Jake Giard scanned his fighter's computer-generated engine indications and then keyed his radio's transmit trigger. Lima 2-4, this is Papa 2-1, go ahead. The radio crackled to life again as his wingman replied. Roger 2-1, come up on internal. Jake nodded and switched his radio selector to the ship-to-ship laser communication terminal. The autonomous system formed a virtual fiber optic link that allowed data to stream between the 2 fighters. A secure internal communication link piggybacked on the data stream. Unlike a radio signal, the laser beam couldn't be intercepted, so fighter crews often used it like a cell phone for air-to-air communication. Hey, Vic, what's up? Over Nellis Air Force Base's remote desert training area, they flew a tight, echelon left formation. From his position just behind Vic's left wing, Jake studied the moonlit silhouette of his wingman's stealthy single-seat fighter. Thanks for doing this. I know you didn't have to take a flight this late. Jake smiled under his oxygen mask. It's not like I had anything better to do at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. The truth was he had plenty he could be doing. However, the junior pilot was having trouble completing his unit indoctrination training. Having already failed 1 check ride, Victor was struggling with the high workload of the unit's close air support scenarios. Jake had volunteered to take him out for additional iterations. However, in preparation for a combat deployment, the squadron's fighter wings were in high gear, training around the clock. So Victor's additional period had been relegated to ODark 30 in the middle of the weekend. Yeah, right, Vic said. I'm sure you'd rather be on a night training flight than partying a Las Vegas Saturday night away with Sandy. Wow, you're right, Jake joked. I'm out of here. He broke his fighter into a left bank and rolled away from Vic's jet. Hey, I was just kidding, Vic said. Having dropped below Victor's line of sight, Jake rolled his fighter level and passed under his wingman's aircraft. Emerging on Victor's right, Jake pulled alongside. In the moon's soft light, he could see the back of his helmet as Vic searched the sky to his left. Over here, Jake said with a chuckle. When the young man's head snapped right, Jake barrel-rolled his fighter over Vic, the maneuver's wide arc carrying him clear of his wingman. It ended with Jake parked off his wingman's left wing, back where he had started. It sure as hell beats working for a living, doesn't it? Vic laughed. When my alarm went off at 2 a.m., it kind of felt like work. Then his tone took on a serious note. Did you see that report on the news tonight? That report. Can you be a little more specific? Sorry. They found more Russian surface-to-air missiles in Afghanistan. Frustrated his attempt at levity had failed to distract the young officer from his unending worries, Jake looked across to his wingman and shook his head. I know where this is headed. Fresh out of flight training, Lieutenant Victor Croft had never been in combat. Last week, the man's jittery nerves had kicked into hyperdrive when their squadron received orders to deploy to Afghanistan's Bagram airfield at the end of the month. Renewed Taliban activity, coupled with enhanced weapons supplied by Iran, had NATO forces reeling. I'm sure they'll have it worked out by the time we get in country, Jake said. He felt guilty playing down the threat. In the last year, the Taliban had employed Russian S-300 anti-aircraft missiles with devastating results. Maybe, Vic said dubiously. I haven't slept since the meeting. Jake remembered the white pallor he'd seen on Vic's face following their deployment brief. Wide, frightened eyes stared from the young pilot's light-skinned ginger face. Drained of blood, Victor's skin glowed through his closely cropped red hair. Be calm, Grasshopper, Jake said. He hoped the poor imitation of a Japanese sensei would allay Vic's continuing apprehension. You'll be fine. Your training will take over once you're in combat. Trust me. Trust you? Vic asked. The humor in the lieutenant's voice was good. Victor thickened his soft hillbilly accent in the way that endeared him with comrades and also won him favor with the Las Vegas ladies frequenting Nellis Air Force Base's Officers Club. Why, because you're from the government and you're here to help me? Exaggerating his own Texan accent, Jake said, Oh, yeah, I forgot. You Appalachians don't cotton us governmental types. Victor laughed. Yep, us hillbillies have a special place in our hearts for outsiders. Now squeal like a pig, boy. Jake's laughter broke as a tremendous shockwave, coupled with a blinding flash, rocked his fighter. Overtaking them from behind, a bright ring of lights had rocketed between the two aircraft. Shit! What the hell was that? Jake said. Recovering from the shock, he adjusted the controls, reining in his battered fighter. I don't know. It must be doing Mach 4, or better. Victor faltered as the object broke right. What the hell? Bolting right, it made a 90-degree turn, changing direction in an instant. One moment it was rocketing away from them. The next it blazed eastward at the same tremendous rate without curving. Holy shit. Nothing could take those G's, Vic said, thunderstruck. Oh my God, Jake whispered. Blinking, he tried to clear his eyes. That's not possible. As if it had no mass or weight, the strange object made several more instantaneous course changes, varying from slight angles to complete course reversals. The maneuvers kept it near their two-ship formation. Its zigzagging path circled the fighters twice, then it stopped for a few moments. Matching their velocity and vector, it parked a mile off Lieutenant Croft's right wing. A moment later, it snapped to within 100 meters of Victor's side of the formation, closing the mile-wide gap in less than a second. Whoa, Vic said with a shaky voice. His fighter jinked away from the object. Easy, buddy, Jake said. Jerking his F-22 left, he narrowly avoided colliding with his wingman. I'm still right here. Sorry, Vic said. I've got nothing on radar. Jake paused, taking a deep breath to reel in his emotions. When it was in front of us, I couldn't see it on infrared either. Hey, I see something, Vic said, panting. There's a shadow. Jake narrowed his eyes. You're right. I see it against the background. Yeah, that's how I spotted it. Gliding above the distant horizon, the ring of lights had dark voids protruding above and below. A brief eclipse of the background stars provided the only visual evidence. So it's not some kind of... Jake paused, searching for words. Energy source? It must have mass. It's gotta be a ship of some sort. Studying it, he paused, then shook his head. But I've never seen anything move like that. Well, if this is one of ours, it's way beyond anything my physics professor knew about, Victor said. Looking across his wingman's fighter gave Jake a chance to estimate the ship's size. Judging by the shadow, it was as tall as it was wide. Like a pregnant frisbee, it was broadest across its middle, where the ring of lights still rotated. Horizontally, it was roughly as long as the F-22, making it just over 60 feet wide. What the hell is it? Vic asked. No idea, Jake said. He couldn't see the skin, but the silhouette's bottom was round, and it looked like the top came to a point. This is incredible. As Jake spoke, the ship started closing the gap. Hey, be careful, it's getting closer. Roger, Vic said. Jake's heart raced as he focused on the ship's middle. Those lights, he faltered, unable to conjure an adequate description. I know, Vic said. He sounded as mystified as Jake felt. A horizontal pulsing ring of multicolored light seemed to rotate in the air around the object's midsection. As the ship neared Victor's fighter, Jake got a clearer view of its structure. As if radiating from the ship's center, the glowing rays only extended a foot or two from the ship's skin, but he couldn't see any fixtures generating the energy. I don't see the source of the lights. They look like raw energy. Watching the strange ship flying in formation with his wingman was both surreal and somehow familiar. I wish he'd pull up front again. My gun camera can't slew that far to the side, Vic said. Recognition smacked Jake. Hey, it looks like they want an escort. You're right, Vic said, then shouted, Jake, do you have your iPhone? Yeah. Concentrating on flying his fighter while keeping an eye on the strange ship, he dug blindly through the bag he'd tucked into the small map pouch next to his right leg. There it is. Yanking out the phone, he turned it on, a clear violation of Air Force regulations. I think they'll forgive this one. Got it. I'll take a couple of quick shots, then drop back and see if I can capture it with my gun camera. Sounds good. Just get it on something. Staring at the phone's glowing white boot-up apple, he shook the phone and growled, Come on! Outside, the ship slid closer. When it parked a few feet off Vic's right wing, his fighter lurched. Jake dropped the phone. What happened? I don't know. It feels like my right wing is trying to stall. Victor's voice cut out as the buffeting rocked his fighter left and right. Broken by turbulence-induced grunts, Victor's voice came over the radio. The stick is beating up the inside of my thighs. He banked left to give Victor space. Get away from the ship. I don't know if I could hold on, Victor said. His voice strained as he fought to control the fighter. Jake threw his transponder into the emergency position, alerting air traffic control. Ears ringing, his pulse raced in response to the adrenaline dumping into his system. Get the hell out of there! A crescendo of static rose in Jake's helmet. Chopped and modulated by the communication laser's failing efforts to maintain connection, Lieutenant Croft's panic-stricken voice broke through the cacophony. Systems! Going down! Damn warning light! Flashing! Day! Mayday! Jake switched back to their assigned radio frequency and keyed the mic. Lima 2-4. Static. Victor, come in. Louder static. The faint glow from Victor's engines faded, then extinguished. His fighter started losing altitude. Jake's mounting alarm ratcheted another notch. Slamming both throttles to idle, placing his fighter in a rapid descent, Jake tried to keep up with his plunging wingman. The external position lights on both fighters began dimming. The static increased to an ear-splitting level, and then it died. Jake's cockpit darkened as all its electronics faded to black. All electrical energy seemed to drain from both F-22s. Switching radios to emergency, he toggled the mic. Mayday, 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 this is Air Force 215. No side tone. Shit, the radio isn't transmitting. He switched back to the air-to-air frequency. Lima 2-4, this is Papa 2-1, come in, Vic. Still no side tone. He couldn't even hear his own voice. A quick check showed his helmet was still plugged into its socket. To Jake's horror, both fighters started drifting toward one another. Oh shit, he whispered. He pulled against the stick, but the unresponsive electronic flight controls refused to budge. Drifting toward Lieutenant Croft's fighter, Jake's ship started an uncommanded slow roll to the right. He yanked and jerked the stick left. Nothing. Without electricity, they couldn't respond. Jake reached for his ejection handles and froze. Already rolling through 90 degrees, his cockpit was aimed at his wingman's fighter. If he punched out now, he'd shoot into the top of Victor's airplane. He watched helplessly as his ship rolled inverted. His F-22's dim shadow fell across Vic's fighter. For a surreal moment, the two stared face to face across the narrowing gap as both struggled with their unresponsive flight controls. An unnatural glow caught Jake's attention. The mysterious ship's multicolored rings of rotating light brightened and then flared as it rocketed away. The only evidence of its departure direction lay in the fading image burned across his retina. What the hell? Instrument lights flared back to life, and his F-22 snap-rolled left. As power restored, the electronic flight controls responded to Jake's desperate tugging. As he rolled away, he saw the ship's blazing departure throw Victor's aircraft into a flat spin. "Shit!" Jake screamed. He flipped his Raptor over, trying to keep his wingman in sight, but the night quickly swallowed the still blacked-out fighter. He checked the radio. It was back online. "Come in, Victor!" No reply. "You're running out of time. Eject! Get the hell out of there, Lieutenant!" he ordered. As if trying to will the event into existence, Jake visualized his small-framed friend yanking on the jettison handle. Switching back to the emergency radio, he transmitted, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday! This is Air Force 215. "Air Force 215, this is Nellis Radio. Please state the nature of your emergency," replied the air traffic controller, her voice maddeningly calm. Before he could reply, night turned day in a brilliant explosion as Victor and his F-22 slammed into the desert floor. "No!" Jake screamed. Tires barked as his fighter touched down. Jake extended the air brake. The fighter decelerated. Heavy-hearted and in an anguished mental fog, he struggled through the after-landing checks. "Air Force 215, proceed to the end of runway 21 right on taxiway Alpha, left onto the ramp. A security police detail is waiting to pick you up." Security police? They're not normally involved in crash investigations. Roger, Nellis Tower. Runway 21 right on Alpha, to the ramp," Jake repeated. His tone was flat, dutiful. Finishing his landing rollout, he saw the promised security detail's flashing lights ahead on the right. He finished the after-landing checks. "What happened to you, buddy? Why didn't you eject?" Hoping to spot his downed wingman, he had remained unseen. Jake had made multiple low passes, searching the small, speed-blurred patch of desert his landing lights illuminated. All the while, he'd monitored the frequency of Victor's portable emergency radio. In spite of numerous calls from Jake, it remained silent. The post-crash fire had raged for 30 minutes, only faltering after it consumed the cache of jet fuel and combustible metals. When the rescue helicopter arrived, its crew performed an extensive search. After an additional 30 minutes, they reported no sign of ejection. Out of fuel and hope, Captain Giard finally obeyed air traffic control's incessant orders and returned to base. Now that he'd landed, Jake slowed his F-22. Reaching the end of the runway, he turned right onto taxiway Alpha as instructed by air traffic control. Ahead, the swarm of security police vehicles generated a myriad of flashing lights. The strobing red, blue, and amber colors reflecting off every surface of his cockpit were an unwelcome reminder of the ship's strange lights. Turning left onto the south end of the ramp, he nosed the fighter into the U-shaped formation of vehicles. Locking the parking brake, he finished the after-landing checks. Ground support personnel, casting nervous looks at the assembled security police vehicles, hooked up the ground power unit. With the GPU connected and powering the aircraft, he received a thumbs-up from an airman who looked ready to bolt. Jake acknowledged the clearance and killed the fighter's engines. To his surprise, the airman did bolt. As Jake's canopy rose, a security police squad, weapons drawn, stormed the plane. "What the hell is this?" he shouted over the whine of the ground power unit's turbine exhaust. "Out of the plane, sir!" screamed a large sergeant. Overwhelmed by the night's events, Jake stared incredulously at the armed squad. Shaking his head in resigned capitulation, he unbuckled his safety harness and unplugged his helmet. Climbing from the cockpit, he started backing down the boarding ladder. Halfway to the ground, he was ripped from the metal steps and thrown face down onto the ramp. He could feel several muzzles pressed into his back. "What the hell?" Jake yelled. His breath lifted a small dust cloud from the tarmac, its asphalt surface warm against his face. "Don't move, Captain!" He continued to struggle. I haven't done anything. This is bullshit. The cold steel muzzle of a large caliber pistol pressed against the back of his neck. Jake stopped struggling. The sergeant, now calm and inches from his ears, said, Captain, I have my orders, and they don't come from any higher, and they don't get any more serious than this. I assure you this is not bullshit. The muzzle lifted from his neck. Now are we done here? Panting, Jake nodded. In less than 5 seconds, the sergeant cuffed him and dragged him to his feet. Thank you, sir. Grabbing Jake's left elbow, he led him to a security police cruiser. The sergeant opened the door, stuffed him in the back, and slammed it. Jake stared out in confused disbelief. What the hell did we stumble into, Vic? Chapter 2. Exhausted eyes stared back from the interrogation room's one-way mirror. Damn it, Captain! What were you doing in that area? The voice echoed off the tiled floors and walls. With only a 4-legged rectangular table and 2 metal chairs occupying its center, the room offered little sound absorption. Turning from his reflection, Jake locked eyes with the Major. For what felt like the 100th time, he said, Sir, as I've been telling you for the last 12 hours, Range Control assigned us that training area. For the 100th time, the Major stared back, unblinking and unbelieving. Knuckles rasped against the room's single door. With a disgusted sigh, the Major shook his head and turned toward it. Come. The door creaked open. A nervous Air Force airman stuck his head into the room. Major Tinsdale glared at him. Damn it! I left clear instructions that I was not to be disturbed. Sorry, sir. You have a call from a General Tannehill. I tried to tell him you were busy. No, I'll take it, the Major said, standing, all annoyance evaporating. Just sit there, Captain. I'll be back. Grabbing his notepad, he strode angrily from the room. The airman nodded at Captain Giard and followed the Major out. Hearing the door lock, Jake turned back to his image in the mirror. A steady dripping sound emanated from a floor drain at the room's center. The ticking second hand of an old government-issue wall clock hanging over the door added its maddening rhythm to the staccato dripping noise. Studying his weary face in the one-way interrogation room mirror, Jake tried to make sense of the situation. It was obvious they knew the two of them had encountered the ship. However, every time he tried to bring it up, the Major redirected him. Tinsdale kept returning to the subject of airspace and timelines. It's as if he thinks we conspired to be there at that particular time. Given nothing to eat and only enough fluids to keep him awake, Jake didn't think that they'd let him free any time soon, if ever. Jake heard the Major shouting unintelligible commands as he came down the hall. The door flew open, and in a storm, Major Tinsdale erupted into the interrogation room. Throwing a stack of papers on the desk in front of Jake, Tinsdale paused, took a deep breath, and sat across from him, head hanging down. To Jake's surprise, the Major looked up with a contrite expression. Captain, I owe you an apology. Stunned, Jake sat back, trying to understand the rapid reversal. Was this some kind of interrogation technique? Was the Major propping Jake up just so he could knock him back down? Reading the distrust, the Major raised his hands, palms facing Jake. It's okay, Captain. I give you my word this is not a trick. Then what the hell is going on? He asked. Belatedly, he added, Sir. Apparently you have friends in high places. His confusion doubled. What? The Major shook his head. You'll be briefed later. He pointed to the stack of papers. But before you can leave, you have to sign these. Lying in bed, gazing at the ceiling, Captain Jake Giard ran fingers through his short, dark hair. His entire body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion. He hadn't slept in the 18 hours since the disastrous encounter. Jake knew sleep wouldn't be the restful reprieve from reality he needed. Only a dark prison waited, a place where he would relive the freakish encounter and the loss of his young friend ad nauseum. Shifting, he propped another pillow under his head and looked outside. The city's uncountable sodium vapor streetlights set his bedroom walls awash with an orange glow. The drawn curtains of his window revealed a beautiful panorama. Viewed from his East Las Vegas apartment on the side of the Sunrise Mountain, the city lights painted across the valley below twinkled like a sea of chipped orange glass beads. From Jake's remote vantage point, the buildings and lights of the Vegas Strip constituted a small portion of the scintillating mural painted across his bedroom window. The cool, crisp springtime breeze ruffled the curtains, creating a welcome distraction. Jake felt his body relaxing as a coyote's howl drifted down from the desert mountainside. A lonely sound, it matched the darkness of his mood. His body jerked with a waking spasm as a jet engine's distant roar drowned out the coyote's wail, claiming dominance over the night air. Muffled by distance, the airplane's din rolled like thunder off the surrounding mountains. "Great," he muttered. Frustrated and exhausted, Jake slid out of bed and stepped across the cool tiles. Pushing the billowing curtain out of the way, he walked to the center of the wide window, intending to close it. Movement in his peripheral vision drew his attention. 2 miles to the north, on Nellis Air Force Base runway 3 left, 200 feet from where he'd been accosted by the base's security police, Jake could just make out the twin fiery blue jet plumes of an F-22 Raptor on a takeoff roll. The solo fighter was a poignant reminder. "Damn it. What happened to you, Vic?" He slammed the glass pane shut. Snapping the curtains closed, he turned and walked back to the bed. Collapsing backward onto its soft surface, Jake stared through the ceiling. What the hell was that thing? "I can't even tell anybody about your death," he said to the empty room. He shook his head sardonically. "Great. The UFO contactee is talking to his dead friend. Wonderful." The day spent in the interrogation room had left Jake confused and questioning his decision to reveal the appearance of the strange ship. Not that Major Tinsdale had allowed any elaboration on the subject. He was under strict orders not to mention the event to anyone. He knew it was standard protocol not to discuss aspects of a mishap during an investigation, but these orders encompassed everything: personnel, equipment, aircraft, and timelines before and after the accident. Ordered to act as if the flight had been canceled, he was not to discuss the night's events nor mention Lieutenant Croft's status. Since when did a man's death become a status? Not that he'd had the opportunity to talk with anyone. Under virtual house arrest, Jake had been instructed not to leave his home. Relieved from duty, he was to spend the remainder of the day and subsequent night resting. Major Tinsdale told him to expect additional instructions the following morning. However, he wasn't sure how that information would arrive. Perfectly functional the previous day, neither his iPhone nor his home phone worked now. Even his internet was down. Also, a nondescript government-issue sedan sat parked out front, its occupant hidden in shadow. The mortgage-like stack of documents he'd signed promised forfeiture of his left nut and firstborn, should he ever discuss any aspect of the night's events. A metallic chime yanked Jake from his thoughts. It was the doorbell. He checked his watch. 10 p.m. Rocked by a sudden epiphany, he sat bolt upright on the mattress. Sandy! He jumped out of bed and scrambled to the closet, searching blindly for his robe. "Can't believe I forgot." The doorbell rang again. "I'm coming," he yelled. Sliding to a stop on the tiled foyer, he opened the door. His girlfriend, Captain Sandra Fitzpatrick, pointed an admonishing finger. "You better not be starting without me." Seeing his face, she stopped. "Oh my God, baby, what happened?" Looking into her deep blue eyes, he felt the day's tumultuous stress drain from his body. "I love you." Eyes softening and stepping through the door, she enveloped him in her sensuous arms. "That's not an answer, but I'll accept it for now." "Thank you." He nodded toward her embrace. "By the way, that's my job." Ever the competitor, she raised a skeptical eyebrow. "I'm allowed to comfort you." Jake gave her a meaningful look. After a moment, she capitulated, allowing him to wrap her up in his strong arms. Fiercely independent since their first meeting in Air Force flight school, Sandy was loath to let anyone do anything for her. As an Air Force fighter pilot, it was a character trait that had served her well. It was only during their private moments that she lowered the ever-present shield and exposed her soft feminine side to Jake. Melting into him, she snuggled her neck into his chest. Her limpid blue eyes stared deeply into his. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too, baby," he reassured her. She leaned back in his arms. "So what happened to you this morning? You didn't call or text me after your flight." "My phone went on the fritz," he said, only half lying. "Your home phone, too? Both of your phones are going straight to voicemail. I didn't know your home number had voicemail." "It does now. Apparently." "How's your flight?" Unwilling to lie outright, he changed the subject, guiding her toward the bedroom. "I thought you were coming here so I could help you relax." The previous night, only a few hours before his and Vic's fateful flight, Sandy had complained that the next day's schedule included a grueling 12-hour battery of tests on a new F-22 avionics configuration. Sweeping her up, he carried her the remaining distance to the bedroom. Sandy wrapped her arms around his neck. Jake smiled. In a French accent, he whispered, "Mon amour, your velocity-induced accelerated stall has firewalled my adiabatic lapse rate." "Oh, I love it when you whisper dirty pilot talk to me." Laying her gently on the bed, Jake grasped the top of her flight suit's full body-length central zipper. Drawing it down, he slowly exposed her heaving breasts, then her dimpled abs, and finally the top of her lace panties. With a devilish grin, he said, "There's my favorite landing strip." "It better be your only landing strip, Captain," Sandy said. She playfully reached between his legs. Looking into his eyes with a mischievous smile, she said, "I have the ball. The hook is down." "He's up on the Navy crap or the hook might retract." "Yeah, right," she said, laughing. Still holding his member, she pulled him into bed. Whomp, whomp, whomp. The sound drilled into Jake's brain. Again, he reached for the fighter's instrument panel, pressing and then punching the cancel button in a futile effort to reset the incessant alert blaring from the flashing master caution panel. Whomp, whomp, whomp. Frustration mounted as the fighter's computer still wouldn't accept his inputs. "My friend is dead, and now my fighter is dying too. Whomp, whomp, whomp. Even the alert sounds wrong. Oh, shit." Dragging himself from the nightmare, his arm rose from the sheets and fell on the alarm clock. The noise continued. With a start, Jake realized it was his home phone that was ringing. He'd left the handset in the living room. "Guess it's working now." Sandy stirred, mumbled something unintelligible, and went back to sleep. After a quick kiss to the top of her head, he leapt from the bed. Sprinting through the living room and sliding to a stop in front of the phone, he checked the number. No name displayed, but he recognized the area code, 202. From his many calls to the area's Air Force offices, he knew it very well. Washington, D.C. This should be it. After a hesitation, he answered. "Hello." "Is this Captain Jake Giard?" asked a feminine voice. Yes, who's calling?" "This is the Pentagon's Office of Air Force Tactical Operations, Planning and Development. Please hold for Captain Allison." Before he could protest, inane elevator music told him she'd already placed him on hold. He was usually happy to hear from his old combat wingman. However, this morning he worried the line would be tied up when the real call came. "Hurry up, Richard." While waiting, Jake thought about the last time he'd seen his and Sandy's old flight school buddy, Richard Allison. He'd been in a hospital bed, only 5 hours after a near brush with death. In spite of his impatience, he found himself wondering how Richard was handling ground duty. If only that bullet hadn't found its way into his engine. 12 months earlier. "Target is 15 kilometers at 279 degrees. Estimate entry into Maverick missile range in 30 seconds, Jake said to his wingman. "Roger, Gunslinger 1-3. Gunslinger 2-6 has visual on the target. Now at heading 278, range 11 kilometers. Target acquisition complete. Missile armed," said Captain Richard Allison. As Richard called out his target data, Jake, from his position off of the right wing of Richard's ground attack configured fighter jet, was completing the same process for his target. "I have lock on. Launching now, Richard said. The Maverick missile roared as it left the FA-16, rapidly accelerating toward an ill-fated anti-aircraft missile launcher. A shudder passed through Jake's fighter as his missile also ripped into the night sky. Second missile is on the way. The Mavericks bore down on the two anti-aircraft weapons. A brilliant flash illuminated the desert as the missiles struck their targets, detonating the warheads and rocket fuel on both launchers. The fireballs incinerated everything within 200 meters. That should do the trick, Richard said. Roger, Gunslinger 2-6. Let's do a quick BDA and head home. Roger, keep it in tight, Richard replied as he turned inbound. Beginning his post-attack battle damage assessment, Jake scanned the infrared display. After a few seconds, he smiled. Scratch 2 more SA-6s. That's 2 less surface-to-air missile launchers to dodge. I wish the Pakistanis would stop this crap from crossing the... Captain Allison's radio transmission cut out mid-sentence as a stream of tracers sliced through the darkness directly in front of the 2 aircraft. Break left, Jake screamed. With the bright orange tracers slicing between the 2 fighters, Jake banked his fighter hard right, narrowly avoiding the wall of lead. Crap, that was close, Jake said. Must have been a Zeus. It was the common nickname for Russia's deadly 4-barreled ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft gun. Good thing he missed. That rate of fire with high explosive shells? The thought sent an involuntary shudder down Jake's spine. I'm hit! I'm hit! Richard screamed over the radio. Oh shit, Jake said. He toggled his radio. Gunslinger 2-6, how bad are you hit? Is it flyable? Over. No reply. Gunslinger 2-6, Richard, what is your situation? A bright explosion flashed from the direction Richard had turned. To his relief, Jake saw the silhouette of a parachute canopy briefly outlined by the light of the exploding fighter jet. Rolling his aircraft to bring weapons on the ZSU, Jake jumped into the job of protecting his wingman. Another burst of fire shredded the night. Like flaming orange basketballs, a new volley of explosive 23mm shells rose from the desert floor, blindly seeking out his aircraft. Apparently, the weapons operator knew not to turn on his radar. That mistake would attract Jake's harm radar-seeking missile. Still, his initial success against Richard's aircraft had made the enemy gunner overconfident. His odds of repeating the original feat were nil. Firing again into the screaming darkness merely supplied Jake with a bright orange dotted line pointing to the source of his friend's demise. His last Maverick missile locked onto the anti-aircraft gun's infrared silhouette. Lifting the guard, Jake fingered the missile launch trigger. Bye-bye. With a pull, he launched the missile. It rapidly accelerated toward and then destroyed the ZSU in a brilliant explosion, briefly bringing daylight to another small patch of desert. Good shooting, Gunslinger 1-3, Jake heard over the emergency frequency. He breathed a sigh of relief at the sound of his downed wingman's voice. Keep transmissions to a minimum 2-6. After all my hard work, I don't want a load of artillery raining down on you. What's your condition? I'll live, but this is Indian country, so hurry with the cavalry already, Richard said. Apprehension seeped through his humorous facade. Jake heard an electronic click as the inane hold music ended. How the hell are you, buddy? Richard asked. Leaning against the bar top separating the apartment's kitchen from its dining room, Jake looked at the ceiling. He took a deep breath and slowly let it out. I've been better. Sorry I haven't called. Things have been crazy here. How's the leg? It's better. As a matter of fact, I just returned to flight status. Listen, Richard, I've got... Not pausing to let Jake finish, Richard kept speaking. In the meantime, I've been assigned to a special unit in the Pentagon. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I'm sorry, Richard, I have something going on here. As much as I'd love to catch up... I understand, he interrupted again. I've been watching your situation develop. We need to talk. Richard. Wait, what do you mean? What do you know? Jake asked, confused. I'd rather not discuss it over the... Jake's frustration boiled over. Damn it, Richard. Nobody wants to discuss this thing. Every time I try to bring up details, they cut me off. I haven't been able to tell anyone what really happened. Lowering his voice, he looked toward the bedroom. I haven't even told Sandy. Richard ignored Jake's rant. You're meeting me in D.C. tonight. What the hell? How can Richard be involved in this? After an extended pause, Jake said, "Okay, I'll tell you more tonight. You're booked on a noon flight out of McCarran. An e-ticket is waiting for you at the United counter." "Okay, Richard," Jake said. His mind reeled. I'll see you tonight." "Good. Tell the lovely and talented Captain Fitzpatrick hello for me, and tell her she's still the second best fighter pilot I know." "You bet," Jake said. He grinned in spite of the confusion. "It's quite chivalrous of you to place yourself in third." "In your dreams, buddy," Richard said through a laugh. Chapter 3. Sandy woke to the sound of Jake's voice in the living room. Heard from across the apartment and spoken in subdued tones, the words were indecipherable. Near the end, his voice rose, and she even heard laughter. The conversation had ended before she deduced that Richard, their flight school classmate, had been on the other end of the line. Jake was so distracted when he returned to the room he didn't notice she was awake. Sandy studied his face. Gone were last night's uncharacteristic stress lines and baggy eyes. Either a night's rest or news from Richard had washed it away. However, she saw something new in his face, an underlying look of confusion. He climbed back under the covers. "Who was that?" she asked. Jake twitched as her voice broke through his apparent trance. "Richard," he answered after a brief pause. His tone was distracted. Lying on his back, he stared at the ceiling. His change in demeanor concerned her. "Is everything all right? How's his leg?" "Well, he's fine. His leg is better." Jake raised his eyebrows. "Actually, he's back on flight status." "Well, that's great," Sandy said. Her head on his left shoulder, she rested her left arm across his chest. "What's wrong?" Jake fell into an uncomfortable silence. After a while, he planted a kiss on her forehead. "I need another hour of sleep." Still lying on her right side, she lifted her head and touched his cheek with her left hand. "Okay, baby." The questions running through Sandy's mind must have paraded across her face. Jake smiled, a resolved expression chasing away his distracted look. "I'm sorry I've been so mysterious. Let's get some more sleep, then I'll tell you all about it." Sandy stared into his eyes. After a moment, she pinched his nose. "You better, mister." She kissed his cheek and rolled onto her back. "Now get some sleep." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am." After setting an alarm on his phone, he placed it on the nightstand. Laying his head back on the pillow, Jake closed his eyes. After a few moments, rhythmic breathing told Sandy he'd fallen back to sleep. He'd always been able to do that. Jake fell asleep with ease, a fact that often annoyed her. Sandy regularly took an hour or more to find it. Being careful not to wake him, she rolled back on her right side to study his face. Even asleep, the underlying confusion she'd glimpsed earlier still furrowed his brow. Looking at him, she remembered the first time they'd met. She thought Jake was an asshole. He and his best friend Richard were cocky to the point of annoyance. While Richard had, in fact, proven to be an arrogant, impatient asshole, she'd grown to love them both. While Jake and Richard had attended the Air Force Academy together, Sandy, a Stanford grad, had recently completed officer candidate school. All three were freshly commissioned second lieutenants, the Air Force's entry-level officer rank. The first time she saw them was at Air Force Flight School indoctrination. The two were loud and obnoxious, so involved in their antics they scarcely noticed or acknowledged their fellow classmates. While Jake's short, dark hair and angular features attracted her attention, she quickly tired of their antics. Later that evening, she saw them again, this time in the officers' club. Seeing Sandy in civilian clothes and not having recognized her, they had assumed she was an officers' club waitress. While Richard was slightly taller than Jake, his abrasive, impatient demeanor left Sandy unimpressed. He immediately began flirting, bragging about being in flight school and how he was certain to go straight into fighters. Sandy had played along, to a point. After a moment of boasting, Richard asked her to be a good bar wench and get them a couple of beers. She went to the bar. On Jake and Richard's tab, Sandy bought herself the most expensive drink listed. Placing it and their 2 beers on a round, cork-lined plastic tray, she walked back to their table. Sandy handed Jake his beer and set hers on the table. As they stared in confusion at the expensive umbrella-clad cocktail, she allowed the unbalanced tray, and the single beer it held, to fall into Richard's lap. Richard scrambled and cussed. In mock horror, Sandy placed a hand over her mouth. "Oops, I guess my center of gravity calculation was off, but what's a lowly bar wench to know about calculating weight, arm, and moment anyway?" Hearing her appropriate use of arcane aviation vernacular, both men stared, mouths agape. While Richard's face only showed surprise and a particular level of distrust, Jake's flashed with recognition. He grinned and said, "Sandra Fitzpatrick." Sandy decided she might like this one. After the initial friction, they had spent the rest of the night drinking, laughing, and swapping life stories. Inseparable throughout flight training, they maintained their friendship in spite of the fierce competition created when the trio shot to the top of their class. Week by week, they exchanged places, each occupying the number 1 position for varying lengths of time. In the end, Sandy was the distinguished honor graduate. Jake and Richard had finished 2nd and 3rd, respectively, a fact Sandy believed still offended Richard's self-important inner asshole. All 3 went directly into fighters. It was during their F-16 fighter transition training that her and Jake's relationship had grown beyond the bounds of mere friendship. The hurt in Sandy's eyes tore at Jake's heart. "Why didn't you tell me about this last night?" she said. After catching another hour of sleep, he'd thrown an overnight bag on the bed and jumped into the shower. When she asked what he was packing for, he'd struggled with what to say. Finally, with no other outlet for his pain, misery, and confusion, he had told Sandy the whole story. Instead of the expected look of disbelief, her face was a mixture of hurt, confusion, and sympathy. "Why didn't you tell me?" she repeated. "You shouldn't be going through this alone. I'm no wallflower, Captain Giard. I'd like to think I'm more than a girlfriend." She stepped up to him. Placing her left hand on his arm, Sandy caressed the back of his neck with her right. Her deep blue eyes gazed into his. "I'm supposed to be the shoulder you can lean on." "Sorry, baby," Jake said. He crowned his eyebrows in his best puppy dog face. "I just wanted to keep my left nut. And our firstborn," he said, jokingly referring to the confidentiality agreement he'd signed. He overemphasized the last part, hoping to make her laugh. To his relief, a coy expression replaced the hurt look. "Don't start making assumptions, Captain Giard, on either account. I believe I own said property, regardless of the bachelor machinations manifest in your interior design, or lack thereof," she said, casting a meaningful look at the apartment's sparse decorations and scattered sporting equipment. "And as to part 2 of your assertion, you'll need to append a hyphen to my last name long before I'll allow said property to facilitate such outcomes." Jake stared into her eyes for a moment. Knowing Sandy was giving him a pass, he fell another day deeper in love with her. Squeezing the hand she'd placed on his arm, he stepped to the overnight bag. "Captain Fitzpatrick, I believe you missed your calling. You most certainly should have been a lawyer." "Pshaw," she scoffed. "I'm the best fighter pilot you know." Laying out his formal dark blue uniform, she adjusted the rows of combat ribbons crowding the area between his aviator wings and the jacket's top left breast pocket. Finishing, she stood and faced him with a knowing look. "Nice diversion, by the way." Jake nodded, a sheepish grin on his face. Kicking off his shoes and hopping on one foot, he none too gracefully changed pants. "I guess I didn't want you to think I'd lost it," he said, catching his balance and looking into her beautiful eyes. Smiling, she playfully slugged him on the shoulder. "Next time you run into an alien ship, you better let me know, mister." He hugged her. "Yes, ma'am, but I didn't say it was an alien. It could be some top-secret technology. For all I know, it could have been an Air Force ship. Hopefully Richard has some answers for me." "If he doesn't, you're going to have to elevate this, Jake." Surprised to hear her echoing the thought hovering in the back of his mind since waking, he gave her a questioning look. She shrugged her shoulders. They can't ask you to cover up an Air Force pilot's death. I don't care what they had you sign. It's not a lawful order. It'll be your duty. Hell, it'll be my duty as well to report this to the Judge Advocate General. Jake nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. I'll be damned if I'm going to let them bury this. But I trust Richard, so I'll give them 2 days to make it right. If they haven't done anything about it by the time I get back, I'll go to the JAG myself. She nodded. If it comes to that, I'll go with you. Jake placed a finger under Sandy's chin. Tilting her face up, he kissed her. She leaned back, looking at him with her left eyebrow cocked. You'll be back in 2 days, right? 2 days, Jake promised. There's not much under the sun that could keep me away even that long. Running fingers through his short brown hair, Sandy looked at him, her penetrating blue eyes peering into his soul. After a long stare, she pushed him away. Come on, Captain. You have a plane to catch. She picked up his packed overnight bag and moved it to the front door. Jake finished dressing. Inspecting his uniform in the mirror, he locked eyes with Sandy's reflection. I love you, lady. I love you more, she said with a smile. They headed toward the front door. Sandy bent over to pick up the overnight bag. Admiring her form, Jake grinned. He loved the way the flight suit conformed to her perfect contours. You keep doing that, and we'll never get out of here. Well, then, by all means, Sandy said. She bent again, casting a devilish grin over her shoulder. Jake laughed. She always knew how to make him smile. He spanked her playfully and took the bag. That's my job? Yes, sir. Giving a playful salute, she opened the door for him. Age before beauty. Chuckling, he stepped outside. Seeing the unmarked dark government sedan still in the parking lot, ominous with its black windows and matching plain black rims, Jake stopped laughing. Shaking his head, he gestured toward the Crown Vic as he walked to the back of his red Corvette. I'm really over all this cloak and dagger bullshit. Sandy cast a wary glance at the car. They'll probably follow us to the airport, she said. Probably, Jake agreed. Popping the rear hatch, he threw in the overnight bag. Opening the driver's door, Sandy grabbed the key fob from him. I'll drop you off. He stopped, mouth agape in mock exasperation. First you try to carry my bag, then you open the door for me, and now you want to drive. You're killing my chivalry, you know. Told you I'll never be a wallflower, baby. You better keep up, Sandy said, as she slid into the vet's seat and started the engine. Jake shook his head in feigned exasperation. Walking to the passenger side, he watched the sedan's occupant watching him. Pulling the Corvette to the terminal's curb, Sandy looked at Jake with a smile. Tell your old flight school buddy hello for me. He's still the third best fighter pilot I know. You too, Jake laughed and shook his head. Be careful, Jake. I love you. I will. You be careful, too. I'll call you when I get settled in D.C. If anything comes up, call me. Yes, sir, Sandy said with a smile and another salute. Walking around to her side of the car, he grabbed the bags from behind the seat. Pausing next to her, he ran a hand across the car's gleaming surface, then patted the top of the driver's door. Take care of my baby while I'm gone, he said with a wink. I will, and I'll take care of your car, too, she said with a smile. See you in a couple days, beautiful. After a passionate kiss, he turned and walked toward the doorway. Crossing the curb, he saw the government sedan pull into the drop-off zone a few car lengths behind the vet. Jake pointed to the unwelcome visitor. You were right. Sandy studied the Corvette's rearview mirror. Spotting the dark Crown Vic, she grinned. In typical Sandy fashion, she raised her arm through the car's open roof and extended her middle finger, giving their unwelcome visitor the bird. Have I told you lately how much I love you? He said, laughing. The one-finger salute shifted toward Jake, and then morphed into a beauty pageant hand wave. Sandy winked at him. Hurry home, Captain Giard. Northbound on Interstate 15, Sandy headed back into town. Apparently only interested in the comings and goings of Jake, the government tail had not followed her beyond the airport. She passed the iconic black pyramid of the Luxor Hotel and Casino. Behind it, Heat waves shimmered above the main east-west runway of McCarran Airport. In the bright blue sky over the dark, triangular building, a single-engine Cessna 150 lumbered into the atmosphere. Having just departed, the airplane probably had a student pilot behind the controls. That reminded Sandy of her father. She'd been a daddy's girl from day one. He always professed to want a son. However, she'd been such a tomboy, more interested in frogs and mud pies than Barbies and unicorns. Her parents had never tried to have a second child, boy or girl. Growing up as an only child, Sandy was fiercely independent. In military flight school, she'd learned that greater than 60% of all Air Force pilot trainees were either an only child or firstborn. Less than a fifth were their family's youngest sibling. But Sandy credited her love of aviation to her father more than her birth status. Up until the supporting airport closed in 2002, her dad had owned a small civilian flight school outside Monterey, California. Carmel Valley Vintage Airport, southeast of the city, had been her childhood stomping ground. She'd been raised as much by her father's small cadre of flight instructors and aircraft mechanics as she had by her parents. While her mother's office-based secretarial job left no one home to watch Sandy, her father's self-directed schedule, coupled with the fact he owned the business, made his hangar a wonder-filled daycare. There, parallel rows of spark plugs became white stallions towing a silver coach in the form of a pitted, cone-shaped chrome spinner from an ancient propeller. There, after a hot day of flight training, sweat-stained instructors dutifully sat at her too small table drinking tea and eating imaginary crumpets. And also there, standing on her daddy's toes, she learned to waltz as Neil Diamond's Mr. Bojangles blared from an old car speaker that hung from a rusty nail. As Sandy exited the highway and turned down a palm tree-lined Las Vegas street, more memories flowed past her mind's eye like an Instagram photo strip. She always remembered those days with the oddly faded colors of a Polaroid picture. Forever frozen in a mental snapshot, Sandy waved excitedly as her father cruised overhead in his Cessna. Its 70s-tastic paint scheme, white with a horizontal two-tone brown stripe running down the side of the fuselage, contrasted starkly against the Polaroid color-shifted blue sky. Growing up, she'd spent many summers, holidays, and after-school hours in her father's hangar. He and a small collection of polyester-clad and mustachioed instructors trained a never-ending string of mullet-sporting students clad in acid-wash jeans. As the years marched past, the 80s and its hair bands were ushered out by Kurt Cobain-loving grunge-clad Gen X pilot wannabes. However, her father and his small cadre of instructors, as well as the airplanes, never changed their colors, or their style, for that matter. With names like Tom, Chuck, Bob, and Jim, they had taught her everything she knew about civil aviation. Dad hadn't even left much for the Air Force to teach her. She still remembered laughing like the schoolgirl she was when her father, trying to teach her how to do a strafing run on an unsuspecting herd, inadvertently chased old man Creech's cows through a wood fence. She loved her mom dearly, but as with most mother-daughter relationships, they had often butted heads, especially in her teenage years. Pressing a button on her phone brought her father's wise, loving, and wrinkled face to its screen. After only one ring, his cheerful voice filled the car's speakers. "Pumpkin! Daddy!" Stepping through the exit into the evening's humid air, Jake felt his uniform starting to cling to his body. For Washington, D.C., it was unusually warm and muggy. He checked his watch. 7:15, left 45 minutes until his meeting with Richard. In spite of the ever-present hustle and bustle, the terminal's passenger pickup area had a dark, lonely feel. The visible portion of the sky was rapidly approaching total nightfall. Harsh bronze light cascaded from noisy overhead fixtures, amplifying the uninviting atmosphere. Behind Jake, the automatic doors kept opening and closing. A drunk curled up next to the exit, tripped its sensor every time he raised a brown bag-covered bottle nestled in his wizened hands. Jake flinched as a harsh voice erupted from his right. "Jesus, Olaf, I told you can't sit there," an airport police officer said with apparent impatience. Walking toward the vagrant, he pointed at the brown bag. "And what the hell is in that? If it ain't Perrier, we're going to have a problem." Jake turned from the drunk's Eastern European accented slurring response returning his gaze to the cars lining the passenger pickup zone. He noticed a man watching him from another dark Ford Crown Victoria, the same color, make, and model as the one that had followed them to the Las Vegas airport. When Jake's gaze lingered, the driver looked away too quickly. "Son of a bitch," he swore under his breath. Walking to the head of the taxi line, he opened the waiting cab's rear door. The taxi driver was climbing out, but Jake held up his small suitcase. "Get in. This is my only bag." Guilt-ridden, angry, and frustrated, Jake felt his blood pressure rising and his face reddening. Last year, he'd watched his best friend get blown out of the sky. Now, Victor was dead. The survivor's guilt was bad enough, but the military's obvious mistrust, evident in the ever-present tale, poured salt, pepper, and acid into a festering wound. In the side view mirror, he watched the stranger cast off his guise as a bored ride waiting for an arrival. Discarding the paper he'd feigned reading, the observer started his car as the cab driver dropped into his seat. "Screw this shit. I'm tired of these bastards." Ignoring Jake's rant, the cabbie asked, "Where'd you want to go, pal?" "O'Hara's Bar and Grill," Jake growled. "You got it, bud. That's about 10 minutes past the Pentagon on the 395. "Okay," he said. Looking over his left shoulder, Jake glared at the sedan. Having been to Washington several times, both as a kid and as a military officer, he had a good feel for the lay of the land. Jake looked at the cab driver's eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. "Go north first, then head east across the river." "That ain't the right direction," the cabbie said. "Just do it. It's your nickel, pal." As the cab pulled out, Jake watched the sedan in the side view mirror. Just prior to disappearing behind a corner, he saw it edge away from the curb. "Once you cross the river, find a place to double back. Then we'll head to O'Hara's. There's a $20 tip in it for you if you can lose that Crown Vic," Jake said, hiking a thumb at the tail. Spotting the sedan and looking nonplussed, the cabbie studied Jake in the rearview mirror. "Look, pal, I don't want no trouble here." Jake pulled a money clip out of his front pocket. Peeling off 2 20s, he leaned forward. "Well, Mr. Jake paused, searching the framed driver's permit hanging on the cab's dash. "Mr. Skolowski." He laid one of the 20s across the man's shoulder. "Here's 20 now." He held up the other so the driver would see it in the rearview mirror. "And here's the 20 I'll give you when you lose that asshole." Skolowski grabbed the bill from his shoulder and pocketed it. "Now you're talking my language, pal." "I thought so," Jake muttered. While the driver merged with interstate traffic, Jake checked their rear. He spotted the black Crown Vic about 100 yards back, hovering behind a yellow 350Z, positioned so the driver could observe the cab, yet still blend with the other commuters careening down the interstate. "So why's this guy following you?" "Guess he wants to take a poll," Jake said sardonically. Shaking his head, the cabbie moved into the left lane. Jake spotted the Potomac River Bridge ahead. Off to the left, through gaps in the trees lining the highway, he glimpsed D.C.'s night cityscape. Parks and monuments formed the only breaks in the ocean of lights. As the cab crossed the bridge, Jake glimpsed the sedan indiscreetly following too closely. Jake was thrown forward in his seat as the cabbie braked hard. The pursuer caught off guard. The gap between the two cars rapidly decreased. Skolowski cut across 4 lanes at a 45-degree angle, barely making the exit on the far side of the river. Impressed by the cabbie's dedication to the cause, Jake looked back, grinning. Too late to make the exit, the dark sedan careened across the highway. The off-ramp dropped below the level of the interstate, cutting off Jake's line of sight. Just as he was sure they'd lost it, the dark sedan shot into view. Leaping the curb, it careened down the side of the embankment. "Jesus!" Skolowski exclaimed. He stomped on the accelerator. "What in the hell does this guy want with you? Even if I could tell you, which I can't, you'd never believe me." Directly behind them, the Crown Vic struck the bottom of the embankment, sending up a spray of grass and mud. It bounced over the curb and onto the off-ramp, only 2 feet behind the cab's rear bumper. "Son of a bitch!" screamed the cabbie, swerving hard right and shooting down a side road. "This is your lucky day, pal. I grew up in this neighborhood." Jake viewed the neighborhood, wondering where his supposed luck would find him. Abandoned cars, sans wheels, and windows lined both sides of the road. A lone streetlight illuminated the path ahead. Jake caught a brief glimpse of 3 teenagers kicking a fourth on the ground. Several consecutive quick turns put some distance between them and their pursuer. Rounding another corner at high speed, the cabbie turned off the car's headlights. Jake tensed. Their speed didn't reduce with the visibility. Without warning, the cabbie spun the wheel hard right, firing the cab into a dark, very narrow alley. One Jake would have laid odds couldn't accommodate a subcompact, much less a 4-door sedan. Still, Skolowski refused to slow. Had lots of practice losing the cops in this neighborhood. Jake gazed through the rear window, watching for the Crown Vic. The wall across from the alley's opening glowed with the lights of the approaching chase car. Long shadows rapidly shortened as the unseen car closed. In a flash of white headlights and red taillights, the car sped past, the glow's quick fade signaling their success. "Let's get the hell out of here," Jake said, handing the cabbie the other 20. Skolowski made a turn out of the alley. 1 turn later, lights on. They were back underway. For a moment, they traveled along the river. The interstate came into view. Skolowski said, "O'Hara's it is." Jake checked his watch. 8 o'clock. He handed the cabbie 2 more 20s. "Here you go, Skolowski. Keep the change. I appreciate your help." "No problem, pal." Jake stepped out and closed the door. The cab pulled away. He walked up to the tavern's rustic wood door. Pulling it open, he stepped into the dark interior. Searching for Richard, he spotted a raised hand in the back. Returning the wave, Jake scanned the tavern for more stalkers. An old couple was seated at the brass-trimmed oak bar. They were watching the overhead television. Otherwise, the place was empty. As Jake approached, Richard stood, extending a hand. "You look like you're expecting someone to jump you." Jake relaxed a bit, smiling at his old wingman. "Today they'll have to take a number." Jake gave him an appraising look. After a moment, he nodded. "It's good to see you." Without addressing Jake's comment, he sat and gestured to the opposite chair. "Sit down, buddy." As Jake sat, Richard grabbed the pitcher and filled a half-thawed frosty mug sitting on a damp, pressed paper coaster. Jake picked up the mug and tilted it toward Richard. "It's good to see you, too." After studying the beer for a moment, he set it down. "Listen, Richard, sorry if I'm being too short or direct, but what the hell is going on?" Richard gave him another appraising look. When Jake opened his mouth to say more, Richard held up a hand. "First, I need to hear your version of what happened yesterday morning." Confused, Jake leaned back in his chair. "My version? Who else's would there be?" Richard looked at him for a long moment. "I can't say much." He paused again, then nodded. "This is sensitive shit. I went out on a limb for you yesterday morning." Remembering the interrogator's words, Jake leaned forward. "You're my friend in high places?" Richard nodded. "But before I climb farther out on that limb, I have to know how it all happened. The timing, the location, everything." After a moment, Jake nodded. Leaning back, he took a draw from his mug. In hushed tones, he related the story. He started with the encounter over Nellis and its effect on Victor's aircraft, and ended with the arrest and subsequent interrogation. When Jake finished, Richard nodded and sat back. "You don't seem surprised by any of this." Richard shrugged. "I'm not." "And?" Jake looked at him with raised eyebrows. "What do you have for me?" "I can't really tell you anything tonight." "Damn it, Richard. This is bullshit." "I think someone already told you this isn't bullshit." Jake froze, mouth hanging open. He hadn't mentioned the security police sergeant's words. "Listen, Jake, what you told me matches what we already thought." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Who's we?" Richard only shook his head. "What about Lieutenant Croft?" Jake said. "A good man is dead and everyone is acting like it didn't happen. I promise you, no one has forgotten Victor. Your story checks out. So by noon tomorrow, things will be much clearer. But, as if swearing on oath, Richard raised his right hand. We didn't bring you all the way here just for steak and beer. Tomorrow, my friend. Tomorrow. We? Let's just say you've stumbled into something bigger than you can imagine. Until you've fully been vetted, you'll be watched and followed. Well, that explains that, he said with a chuckle. Grabbing the pitcher of beer, Jake filled their mugs. Huh? After setting down the empty jug, Jake tipped his mug in a toast. Guess it's safe to say you'll be hearing from a pissed-off agent. Jake told him about the exciting taxi trip. Richard laughed. I can't believe it cost you $40. Well, it didn't cost me a thing. I'll be giving you the expense report. Yeah, good luck collecting on that one. So what else can you tell me? Jake asked. Like I said, tomorrow. Jake stared back at him. After a few moments, he lifted both hands. Okay, I surrender. Chapter 4. Captain Jake Giard woke with a start and a feeling of joy. Blinking the sleep from his eyes and looking around the room, he squinted against the glare of a lone sliver of light knifing through the dark air. As he studied the dust motes drifting through the streetlight's phosphorescent casting, Jake felt the elation fade with the dream that birthed it. Remembering where he was, he slid to the edge of the bed adjacent to the window. No longer blinded by the streetlight's laser-like beam, he looked around the dark, musty room. Slowly, it drifted into focus. To Jake's right, an ancient digital clock radio sat atop a bedside table. With an audible click, its dimly lit black metal tabs with white numerals flipped over to reveal 0600. With a grunt, Jake sat up. Reaching over, he turned on a small lamp standing next to the clock. He flinched as its harsh rays burned into his sleep-addled brain. As Jake tried to rub the pain from his eyes, the events of the previous night washed across his thoughts, the latter parts a bit fuzzy. They'd shared more than one pitcher of beer. Light banished the last of the dream. The fog of sleep evaporated, taking the elation with it. While he couldn't remember the details of the dream, he vaguely recalled speaking with Victor. It was a nice notion. However, now sitting in the beam of harsh street light falling through the parted curtains, he needed to deal with reality. His wingman was still dead. Damn it, Jake croaked through his parched throat. Flinging the covers back, he stepped from the bed and walked to the window. Sliding the curtains open, Jake studied the few pre-dawn stars that managed to burn through the city's light pollution. What happened to you, Vic? Please sign in here, sir, and have a... Walking quickly, Richard swept into the office. That won't be necessary. He won't need to sign in. As a matter of fact, he isn't here at all. Gesturing to Jake, he added, Come with me, Captain Giard. Who won't need to sign in, sir? I don't see anyone, said the young Army private through a conspiratorial smile. Thank you, Betty. Please forward my calls to voicemail. He hiked a thumb at Jake. The Invisible Man and I will be out for the rest of the morning. Yes, sir, she replied. Playfully grabbing Jake by the back of the neck, he pushed him toward the door and back into the Pentagon's labyrinth of hallways. Walking down the long, sterile corridor, he looked at Jake with an exaggerated grimace. You look like shit. How's your head this morning? Jake grinned. My head's not too bad, but when I woke up, my liver was on the pillow next to me crying. Actually, in the 2 hours since waking, the combined effect of coffee and aspirin, coupled with a surprisingly peaceful cab ride, had left Jake feeling much better physically. But enough about me. What's the plan? Patience, grasshopper. Rounding a corner, they stepped into a dead-end hallway. At the far end stood a very serious-looking guard next to a table and an elevator door. Jake didn't see a call button. However, a keypad and some kind of lens sat above its expected location. As they approached, the guard nodded to each of them in turn. Good morning, Captain Allison. Captain Giard. Jake blinked his surprise at the guard's foreknowledge of his name, his gaze snapping from the apparent camera lens back to the sergeant. Good morning, Doug, Richard said as his fingers danced across the keypad. Bending slightly, he looked into the lens. Jake heard a beep and saw a green light illuminate on the keypad's small screen. "Good morning, Captain Allison," a computer-rendered male voice said. "Good morning, Hal," Richard said, looking at Jake with a crooked grin. Gesturing, he said, "Step over here and look into the lens." He complied. As soon as Jake looked into the glass eye, a red glow filled his vision, followed by the same beep and computer-generated voice. "Good morning, Captain Giard." Jake looked at Richard. "How does it know me?" "Don't ask. I could tell you, but I would have to kill you," Richard said with mock seriousness. Jake spun on him. "God damn it, Richard. Enough with the jokes already. Someone really did get killed over this shit." Richard's head snapped back as if Jake had slapped him. To his credit, the sergeant didn't flinch. Richard raised both hands. "I'm sorry, Jake. That was thoughtless of me." The elevator doors opened, and Richard motioned for Jake to enter. "Bear with me a little bit longer." After a moment, Jake shook his head and walked into the elevator. Still fuming, he studied its interior walls. All four surfaces were brushed stainless steel with no discernible fixtures or buttons. The doors slid closed, and to his surprise, the elevator went down from the ground floor. Richard merely smiled with that maddening, humorous indifference. The elevator continued downward. Jake felt the pressure building on his ears. Pinching his nose, he performed the Valhalla maneuver. His ears popped, and the pain subsided. "How the hell did that computer know me?" he asked again. Richard pinched his nose in an apparent effort to clear his ears too. In a nasal tone, he said, "For the last 20 years, the military covertly scanned all recruits' retinas." "How?" "A camera built into the ophthalmoscope the doctors use for their initial entry exam snaps a shot of each retina. It's added to the recruit's file and to the master database." The elevator slowed and stopped. The doors opened, revealing a modern hallway, its design far removed from the comparatively ancient architecture of the Pentagon, now an unknown distance above them. Another pair of serious-looking guards flanked a double door at the end of the hallway. The walls and doors were highly polished black onyx, trimmed with brushed stainless steel. Jake recognized the type of flooring. "There must be a lot of computers on this level." Richard looked surprised. "What makes you think that?" He pointed at the floor's grid of panels. "That's a raised floor. The underlying crawlspace is used to distribute chilled air and run cables between server racks." "Astute observation." They approached the doors. "So what is this place?" "I could tell you." Richard pointed at the larger of the two guards. "But then he'd have to—" Seeing Jake's warning glare, he stopped mid-sentence. "Sorry." In a deep, humorless monotone, the mountainous guard said, "Captain Allison, Captain Giard, IDs, please." Taking their cards, he passed each under a laser scanner. It beeped twice. Nodding, he returned them. "Please proceed, sirs." Turning, Richard reached out, placing his palm against a panel next to the doors. A red glow emanated from the pad. It beeped like the one upstairs. "Good morning, Captain Allison," the computer said. The double doors parted. Noise from the busy room beyond flooded the quiet corridor. Richard walked through, and Jake followed. Inside, the architecture was identical to the entry hall, but on a much larger scale. While the corridor was empty, this area was teeming with activity. Personnel, both civilian and military, scurried about. It looked like NASA's mission control. Large monitors adorned the far wall, while rows of computer consoles filled the large chamber's center. Jake scanned the room, surprised to see so many foreign uniforms. Strange accents and languages were interspersed in the bustling room's din. Whatever it was, it had to be a multilateral, multinational effort. He turned to Richard. "Again, what the hell is this place?" Smiling, Richard pointed to the back wall. Turning, Jake saw a beautiful scene on one of the large monitors. The image feed came from a camera orbiting high above the planet. The video quality was amazing, like looking through a window into space. Earth's curving horizon filled half the image. Irregular, halting movement drew Jake's attention. One of the stars in the image's right side appeared to be moving. Then it blossomed to fill half the screen. To his shock and bewilderment, no one in the control room reacted to the development. Looking around the room, mouth agape, his pulse quickened. Confused and angry, he turned back to the monitor and glared at the ship that had killed his wingman. It darted out of frame, its extreme acceleration leaving only a hint of its departure direction. Jake was dismayed that those who had obviously seen the spaceship continued with their tasks. He turned to Richard, only to see that same infuriating smile on his face. Jake blew up. "What's so goddamn funny?" Then he realized Richard wasn't grinning at him, he was looking over Jake's shoulder. A familiar voice spoke up from behind him. "It's about time you got here, Captain." Jake turned and came face to face with his suddenly not-so-dead wingman. Standing in the bustling underground control room, Jake stood with his mouth agape. Head spinning, he stared at Lieutenant Victor Croft. A mix of emotions and confusion flooded his thoughts. What the hell? "Well, it's good to see you too, Captain," Vic said, laughing. Victor's chortling broke through Jake's shock. He grabbed the young man in a bear hug, nearly crushing his reanimated wingman. "Holy shit, Vic. You got out after all. Thank God." Jake shook his head. Hell, I knew you were dead," he said, finally setting him back down. "Why didn't you—" "Let's move this to the conference room," Richard interrupted, placing a hand on Jake's elbow and nodding toward the control room's occupants. Jake turned in the room's abrupt silence. While the appearance of a strange ship hadn't fazed the assembled personnel, the reunion had brought all activity to a standstill as everyone watched. Confused and unsure of what to say in spite of all the questions running through his mind, Jake looked from the onlookers to Richard, to Victor, and then back to the large monitor. Overwhelmed, he allowed Richard to guide him to a door on the side of the control room. After climbing a flight of stairs, they passed through another door into a conference room. A long table surrounded by chairs occupied its center. A glass wall separated it from the control room. Jake walked to the clear wall. Watching the activity below, he again felt overwhelmed. His mind raced with a multitude of questions. Moving to stand on both sides of him, Victor and Richard joined Jake at the window. Richard said, "It's a lot to take in." "You think?" Jake shook his head and turned from the window. He grabbed a chair and fell into it. With his back to the conference table, he looked from Richard to the strange control room and finally to Victor. He struggled to comprehend the developments of the last 5 minutes. "What the hell is going on here?" "Lieutenant Croft," Richard said, pointing to the head of the table. "Please debrief the good captain." Vic walked toward the end of the table nearest the door. "I still don't know the whole story, but I can tell you my part of it." Richard nodded. "That's fine, Lieutenant." Jake stared at him. "I'm all ears." "Okay," said Vic. Sitting down, he turned to Jake. "As you know, when that ship showed up, everything went to hell. When he got too close, I lost control of my fighter." "Yeah, me too," Jake said, nodding. Victor also nodded. "I figured that when your fighter rolled on top of mine, but when it left, mine didn't recover like yours did. Somehow its departure threw me into an inverted flat spin. No matter what I tried, I couldn't recover it." "So, you were able to eject after all?" "Nope," Victor said, with an indecipherable grin. 50 hours earlier. "Oh my God!" Victor screamed over the radio. With a white-knuckled death grip on the controls, he fought to rein in the violently shaking fighter. He keyed the radio transmit button again. "The stick is beaten up at the inside of my thighs." Through the building roar of turbulence buffeting the airframe, he heard Jake over the radio. "Get away from the ship!" "I don't know if I can hold on," Victor said, his voice straining as he was thrown against the harness. Multiple caution and warning lights illuminated, filling the cockpit with their red and amber brilliance. Blaring from his helmet speakers, squealing horns and mounting static drilled into his head. In a cascading collapse, system after system crashed. Still struggling to control his bucking fighter, Vic looked up from the flashing warning lights to the strange ship. "Get the hell away from me!" Panic's icy fingers gripped his heart. He squeezed the radio transmit trigger. "My systems are going down. Every damn warning light is flashing," he shouted into the building's static. He couldn't tell if the radio transmitted. "Mayday! Mayday! He screamed. His helmet audio cut off mid-word as all electrical systems crashed. The cockpit lights faded to black, and the screaming static evaporated. The fighter's electrically actuated flight controls locked up. Victor struggled with the stick, but his aircraft remained unresponsive. He looked across to the strange ship. "Move!" A shadow crossed his cockpit. Looking up, he froze. Upside down and on a collision course, Captain Giard's fighter loomed overhead, blocking out the moon. "Come on!" Victor screamed. Looking across the narrowing gulf, yanking futilely against the flight controls, he tried to slide lower into the fighter's ejection seat. Light flooded his cockpit, banishing the fighter's shadow. Dragging his eyes from the impending doom and surreal image of Jake looking down on him, he watched the strange ship's ethereal ring of lights grow blindingly bright. Then it flashed away from his jet. A tremendous shockwave threw Victor against his restraints. Shit! Somehow the ship's departure knocked his fighter into a flat spin. Knowing Jake was only a few feet away, he cringed. Alternating waves of light swept through the cockpit as his spinning fighter emerged from under the shadow of Jake's airplane. Looking up, he saw Captain Giard's F-22 rolling away. Victor's momentary elation was quashed as his fighter tumbled inverted. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" His quivering voice squeaked into the dead radio. "Damn it!" he screamed, pounding the lifeless instrument panel. Following his emergency restart procedures, he flipped switch after switch, to no avail. Knowing he was running out of options and time, he looked up from his upside-down fighter to see the Nevada desert floor way too close. In panic's icy grip, he frantically clawed at the ejection handles. An eternal second later, his fingers wrapped around them. He yanked with all his might. Nothing. They didn't budge. Shit! He tugged and yanked several more times. Still nothing. Inverted, knowing death was imminent, Victor tilted his head back to watch the desert race up and devour him. He blinked, not believing his eyes. The strange ship had returned. It was outside, falling in formation with his fighter. What the hell? Looking past the ship, he realized they weren't falling. They were still descending, but at a much slower rate. Shit, he whispered. Vic's heart rate skipped a beat as a loud explosion ripped him from his awed trance. As if belatedly reacting to his ejection handle pulls, the canopy's jettison bolts exploded. Victor squeezed his eyes shut and ducked his head, bracing for the anticipated rush of wind. But it never came. Opening his eyes, he watched the separated canopy float away as if it were in the zero gravity of space. In spite of the slow-motion fall, Victor could feel the desert growing closer. Time to get the hell out. He actuated the seatbelt release, intent on a manual bailout. As soon as the harness unlatched, he felt an odd tugging sensation in his abdomen. Before he could react, Victor was yanked clear of the fighter. Oh, shit! He flailed, belatedly grasping for a handhold. All senses screamed free fall, but there was no wind, and the desert still wasn't rushing up. The tugging sensation increased, pulling him across the narrow gap. In an adrenaline-induced temporal disconnect, he perceived the half-second crossing in slow motion. Bridging the gap, he watched the ship's incredible pulsing, multicolored ring of lights pass less than 2 feet overhead. Reaching out, Victor's hand grazed the ethereal beams. For a fraction of a second, it felt like the center of the ship contained the mass of a black hole. Caught in its tremendous gravitational field, his hand slammed down like a metal rod to a magnet, but the instant it passed out of the light, the force evaporated. However, the gentle tugging sensation in his gut persisted. Passing beyond the ring of lights, Vic flew under the strange ship. Like a hole in the sky, it loomed over and ahead of him, obscuring half the world. Its barely perceptible black mirror skin appeared to absorb almost all light that fell on its surface. Heart racing, he threw his hands up to absorb the imminent impact. Just as Victor was about to hit, He heard tearing paper, and the skin in his path evaporated. He floated into the ship, and the skin resealed, plunging his weightless body into a silent, mind-swallowing void. Hyperventilating, he floated in darkness. His panicked mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. Wide-eyed, Vic snapped his head left and right in a desperate search for visual clues. Nothing. Something touched the sole of his boot. Victor screamed. After a moment of panicked flailing, he realized it was the floor. Gravity was returning. A few seconds later, he crouched on a textured metallic surface. Still in complete darkness, Vic reached overhead. Finding no obstructions, he slowly stood. "What a panty waist," his mother chided through a mirthless laugh. "Not now, Mother," Victor whispered. Looking down, he shook his head. Now that her pestering persona had set up camp in his thoughts, she'd not soon stop. In the deafening silence, his heart pounded like an express locomotive. "Pull it together," he whispered. Closing his eyes, Victor held his breath in a desperate attempt to rein in his terror. After a few seconds, and with no further comments from his overbearing maternal mental hitchhiker, he relaxed. Feeling calmer, he extended his arms sideways and ahead, probing for a wall. After a moment, he realized he could see his hands as dark silhouettes against a dimly glowing background. Facing away from the wall he'd passed through, Victor edged forward until his hands brushed against the surface. As he swept them left and right, the ivory glow intensified, revealing he'd passed into a small, oval-shaped room. A gray floor formed the only flat surface. "What the hell is this?" The wall evaporated under his fingertips as a tearing paper sound echoed through the small space. Victor jumped and stumbled backward, not stopping until slamming his back into the outer skin. Blinking and panting, he stared at the new opening. A 6-foot section of the wall had dematerialized, creating a doorway leading deeper into the ship's interior. Beyond, impenetrable darkness swallowed the light from Victor's small room. Standing, he studied the door and dark void beyond. As his eyes adjusted, he began to perceive soft light in the next chamber. It was much larger than his small oval-shaped room. Inching forward, sure any moment a fanged alien would pop out and snatch his life, Victor worked his way to the opening where he froze, unsure how to proceed. The disembodied voice of his widowed mother chastised, "Come on, pussy, grow some balls!" The woman's nagging and berating began in earnest during Victor's 11th year, following his father's untimely death. Every time she found her only child unworthy of the title man of the family, she showered him with insults, belittling Vic in front of friends and family alike. In his head, her unending denigration continued. "You pansy. If they wanted you dead, you'd be a crispy bug stain on the desert floor." Goaded into action, he crouched and poked his head through the opening for a quick scan. Inside, he discovered a large circular room that appeared to span the entire width of the ship. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, his heart skipped a beat. 3 figures stood in the center of the large space. Victor was on their left. They weren't looking in his direction, although in the darkness he couldn't be sure. Thinking of Neil Armstrong's famous words, he extended a trembling leg into the ship's main cabin. "One small step, my ass." Not comfortable with the thought of sneaking up behind unknown aliens and unwilling to shout, "Here I am," he turned left, planning to follow the curving exterior wall until the aliens acknowledged his presence. Or eat me. Before Victor finished his 3rd step along the curved surface, the entire wall, a full 1/3 of the ship's horizontal circumference, vanished. The view outside shocked him into momentary paralysis. Recognizable from any altitude, the brilliant lights of Las Vegas receded over a shrinking, curved horizon. Looking down between his boots, Vic saw the black void of the Grand Canyon slide into view. Finding himself precariously balanced on a ledge miles above the surface broke his paralysis. Launching backward toward the middle of the ship, Victor landed gracelessly on his ass. He crab-walked a few feet farther before dawning realization froze him. If the wall had evaporated, he'd have been sucked out. Vic didn't know their exact altitude, but he knew they were already well above an airliner's cruising level. Judging by Earth's curvature, they were gaining more altitude every second. Considering the contained pressure differential, he knew there must be something physical present. Either the wall had turned clear, or a force field was in place. Loath to let any gaffe go unnoticed, his mother chimed in. "Sure, just sit there, pussy. I'm sure the big, scary aliens are duly impressed." Victor shook his head. He could practically hear the spittle flying from her pursed lips. Sub-vocalizing, he said, "Shut up, mother." Gathering himself and steadying his nerves, Lieutenant Croft stood and crept back to the wall. Looking down, he could see they had climbed above the atmosphere, reaching orbital velocity and altitude in the few minutes it took him to clear the small room. Looking back to its opening, Victor recognized it as an airlock. The acceleration must have been incredible, but he'd never felt the ship move. Somehow, this vessel's interior was disconnected from inertia. Thinking of how they'd pulled him into the ship, Vic realized the ship must also control gravity. Looking over his right shoulder, he saw the three beings still hadn't acknowledged his presence. As far as Victor could tell, they hadn't even reacted to his graceless dismount of the imagined planetary-scale precipice. A walking thesaurus in the vernacular of her son's unending failures, his mother would have described that little foible as a maladroit. Shaking off the thought, he studied the figures. From his closer vantage point, he realized they were standing behind a console. Oriented toward the center of the wide, clear wall, it was about 4 feet tall and topped with an angled, curving glass. Like holograms in a science fiction flick, enigmatic three-dimensional multicolored figures floated over its surface. In height and width, the three beings appeared to have the same proportions as a human. Each had 2 arms and 2 legs. However, Vic couldn't discern anything beyond that in the ship's dark interior. The holograms seemed to respond to their manipulations, although it was impossible to tell what they were doing from this distance. He saw the center figure's shadowed head look beyond the control panel, as if studying something outside. Falling back to his original plan, Vic crept along the invisible wall, keeping a respectful distance from the miles-high ledge. He divided his attention between the aliens on his right and the incredible panorama to his left. Below, cities formed beautiful pools of scintillating lights. As the ship continued eastward, their prevalence increased until there was more city than dark countryside. Then it abruptly ended. White light gave way to the zigzagging black boundary of a dark ocean. "Holy shit," Vic whispered. They were already passing over the Atlantic Ocean. The ship started a slow rotation. Originally oriented backward, its clear wall had been facing west. Still traveling east, the vessel turned through north. As it slowly rotated to face the oncoming eastern horizon, a carmine sun peeked from behind Earth's curved surface. A thin red beam sliced from right to left across the cabin's dark interior. Rising through the layers of the atmosphere, the orb changed from red to orange and then to yellow. As the vessel continued its clockwise eastern rotation, the sun painted a sweeping mural of shifting colors across the room's left wall. Having reached the front center, Victor took a deep breath and turned to face the beings. Silhouetted against the eastern horizon's glow, he stood between their apparent control console and the clear wall, feeling naked, exposed. However, the ship hadn't finished its rotation. His hosts remained dark voids in the room's brightening interior. Behind him, the sun continued along its horizontal arc, its brightening rays slowly banishing the ship's internal shadows. Marching inexorably across the ship's interior, the sun's light finally fell across the trio. Victor froze, unable to comprehend what he saw. "This doesn't make sense." Confusion morphed into anger. He screamed, "What the hell is going on here?" Unresponsive, the 3 perfectly normal human beings simply stared back. "What are you doing? You nearly killed me and my wingman, you crashed my fighter and scared the shit out of me. What the hell?" Silent and expressionless, they continued to stare at Victor. He looked around. "Where'd this ship come from, anyway?" Infuriatingly, they just stared back, mild humor the only detectable emotion. Finally, The center one answered in a heavily accented language. Victor didn't understand the words. They sounded like Afrikaans, but all wrong. "What?" he asked. The apparent leader held up his right index finger in a hold-on gesture. His other hand moved back to the strange-looking panel. A rotating, three-dimensional green hologram of a human brain emerged from its surface. Rising above the control panel, it hovered between them. Victor looked from the hologram to the man with a questioning look. To his surprise, the holographic brain mimicked his head's movements. Thinking it might be a coincidence, Victor turned his head left and right. The green brain did the same. A vertical stack of holographic cubes streamed through the air to the left of the brain. Each block had a different color and a unique symbol. No longer worried the ship's occupants might be toothy aliens with a taste for human flesh, Victor stepped in for a closer look. He thought the symbols on the boxes might be part of some arcane computer language. The center man apparently found what he was looking for. He made a gesture, and the cascading cubes rolled to a quick stop. Reaching into the hologram, he tapped a virtual box. To Victor's surprise, the cube moved as if it had mass. As it slid out of the column, a new cube, identical in color and symbol to the one now in the leader's hand, coalesced out of thin air, filling the vacated slot. Raising it to eye level, the man looked at Victor through the semi-transparent purple cube and grinned. The holographic brain swelled to the size of a beach ball. Winking at Victor, the man tossed the cube into it. Forming concentric rings, small waves radiated from the point of impact, like water disturbed by a falling rock. An oil can popping sound rang out as the cube breached the surface. Dizzying vertigo buckled Victor's knees. He fell backward. Something resembling a lounge chair rose from the floor and caught him. He sat unmoving, disoriented by a strange tingling sensation. It felt like something was tickling his brain. As the impression passed, he shook his head. Victor looked up at the three men staring down on him. Before he could ask them what had happened, the leader spoke again. Before I could say anything, he spoke again, Victor said. The enigmatic smirk returned. And I understood him perfectly. Confused, Jake closed his gaping mouth. What do you mean? Was he speaking English? No, he was still speaking in that strange language. And you could understand him? Yep. Maddeningly, Vic didn't elaborate. He just sat there, grinning. Jake grew impatient. What? What did he say? After a theatric pause, Lieutenant Croft continued. He said, "Welcome home, brother." Chapter 5. This is where it gets interesting, a new voice said from the doorway. Jake turned to see a wiry, middle-aged Air Force brigadier general enter the room. All three men scrambled to their feet and snapped to attention in response to the sudden appearance of a very senior Air Force officer. The officer chuckled. At ease, gentlemen. Relaxing from rigid attention, Jake turned and read the general's name tag. Tannehill. It was the uttered name that had ended his interrogation. Looking at Richard, Jake cocked an eyebrow. And the plot thickens. Walking to the head of the long table, General Tannehill motioned for them to take a seat. He grinned to Jake. You don't know the half of it, son. The three men sat down. Jake leaned back in his chair. Well, sir, I haven't felt this naive since Betty Sue Alford kissed me during third-grade recess. The general smiled. I'm not sure I can be as enlightening as Betty Sue, but I'll try to clear up a few things for you. Sliding out the end chair, the general sat. Leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, General Tannehill pointed at Jake. Let me start off by saying I'm very impressed by how you've handled yourself. All the way through the incredible events of the last 2 days, you've acquitted yourself nicely. Tannehill gave him a knowing look and winked. Even considering last night's taxi flight to freedom. Jake's face flushed. Richard and Victor both laughed. The senior officer leaned into his chair and held his hands up in a penitent gesture. I hope you'll accept my apology for all the subterfuge. A million questions ran through Jake's mind. "Sir," General Tannehill extended an index finger. "Before you ask, allow me to give you a brief history lesson. Hopefully that'll clear up most of your questions." Surrendering, Jake leaned back in his chair. "Sir, you have my complete and undivided attention. Well, as you may have guessed, we're not alone. It turns out the Milkyway galaxy is teeming with life." He pointed through the ceiling. "There are thousands of sentient species out there." General Tannehill paused, allowing Jake a few seconds to absorb the news. Jake's mind reeled with the new revelation. He looked around the room, expecting to see one of its occupants grinning. They weren't. The General's assumption that Jake had guessed they weren't alone was wrong. He'd been prepared to accept that the Air Force or some other governmental agency had acquired radical new technology. The presence of humans aboard the strange ship only reinforced the notion. Jake turned incredulously toward the General. "Thousands, sir? No disrespect, but you're pulling my leg, right?" He pointed at Victor. "Lieutenant Croft said the ship's occupants were human." With an understanding smile, General Tannehill held up a hand. "Bear with me, Captain. But, sir, if there are thousands—" He paused, searching for words. "Well, they'd be hard to miss. Surely we would have seen them long before this." The General's smile expanded. "We did. May I continue?" Shocked, hands raised in surrender, Jake sat back. "Sorry, sir, please do." Tannehill smiled sympathetically. "It's okay, Captain. I've been in that seat myself." Leaning forward, he activated a computer embedded in the table. The room darkened, and a storm of lights swirled overhead. Looking up, Jake froze in open-mouthed amazement. After a few seconds, the pinpoints of light coalesced into a vibrant hologram that filled the space between the long table and the ceiling. "That's beautiful," he whispered. Nearly filling the room, a stunning 20-foot-wide, three-dimensional rendering of the spiral-armed Milky Way galaxy rotated majestically over their heads. General Tannehill continued as if a hovering hologram were an everyday occurrence. "The predominant species is an ancient race called the Argonians. Steeped in tradition and spread throughout hundreds of star systems, they founded a trans-galactic government thousands of years ago. While it was started by the Argonians, it is an inclusive, representative government providing peace and stability equally to all, regardless of species or stature." He toggled the computer's touchscreen. A truly alien bust filled the display. Chirping melodiously, a feathery bird-like creature's obvious sentient eyes peered through a colorful plume. "Argonian?" Tannehill shook his head. Fading, the avian was replaced by a furry, squeaking mouse-like being. Beaming with intelligence, its eyes twitched nervously back and forth under a gold flight helmet. Then an alien with a grouper's fish face spoke in a deep tone, the meaning of its gurgling words a mystery. An accelerating myriad of visages paraded through the hologram, morphing through various species: reptilian, amphibian, and several more avian and mammalian analogues. Jake was unable to class some, including one that looked like a talking rock with a matching gravelly voice. The last one faded, and the hologram vaporized. Jake's gaze dropped to the General. Their eyes. He paused, searching for the right words. Regardless of color or shape, they all burned with intelligence. "Astute observation, Captain," General Tannehill said with an appreciative nod. "So which one was Argonian?" Jake asked. "None." Apparently disinclined to expound, the General continued his presentation. His fingers danced over the embedded keyboard, and a new hologram coalesced overhead. He pointed at the rotating icon. "The seal of the United Galactic Federation, the Argonian-founded institution that has successfully governed the galaxy for thousands of years." Several unidentifiable symbols adorned its surface. However, Jake was surprised to see familiar images of interlinked rings, birds, and green leaves prominently displayed on the revolving hallmark. The hologram changed back to the rotating galactic plane, and the General continued. "It's a big galaxy. Unimaginably big. Even with all of their assets and technology, the Argonians still haven't charted every sector. So a couple of thousand years ago, they deployed a self-propagating network of sensors. Jake watched a grid of luminous green points spread across the 20-foot-wide galaxy. Numbering in the tens of thousands, the rendered devices gave the entire galaxy a green hue. They're designed to look for a myriad of signals associated with burgeoning technological societies. Jake nodded, enthralled. In 1945, we got their attention, the general said, with a meaningful look. After a moment, Jake put it together. We detonated our first nuclear weapon. Yup, Richard chimed in. Apparently, unnatural fission reactions rate pretty high on their list. The general nodded. When the Argonians detected the electromagnetic pulse, they deployed 2 scout ships to our sector of the galaxy. Upon arrival, they identified Earth, a previously unknown and uncharted planet, as the source. When they began observations, they made a stunning discovery, one requiring an immediate report to the Galactic Federation. The general paused, a grin spreading across his face. Jake was on the edge of his seat. What was it? The rotating Milky Way morphed into a human head and shoulders. A man in his mid-20s stared at Jake. Aside from the odd cut of his uniform, he looked like a normal person. Jake looked from the holographic man to General Tannehill. I'm confused, sir. The general pointed. There's your Argonian. Jake leaned back. What? To the surprise of the scouts and the Argonian leadership, Earth had been populated by Argonians, or as we refer to ourselves, humans. Holy shit, Jake whispered. Embarrassed, he looked at the general. Sorry, sir. The general chuckled. I think I said the same thing. With dawning realization, Jake turned to Vic. That's what he meant by brother. In reply, Vic said something, but Jake didn't understand him. What? Jake asked. Victor said a few more words, and Jake realized it wasn't English. Actually, it was a language he'd never heard. Jake turned to General Tannehill as the man finished entering a command into the computer. A 2-foot-wide holographic brain popped into existence over that end of the conference table. To its right, a vertical queue of 4-inch-wide cubes matching Victor's description streamed past. As each box in the descending column reached the tabletop, it vaporized. At the same time, a new cube coalesced at the top of the line. Every box was a different color, and each had a unique symbol. The general studied the boxes. When a translucent purple one came into view, he reached in and grabbed the 4-inch cube between thumb and forefinger. As if it were solid, the box left the streaming line of icons. Again, just as Victor had described, a new box appeared in the emptied space. Holding the cube at eye level, Tannehill studied its symbol. To Jake, the figure looked like a curved leg numeral 7 with a horizontal equal sign bisecting its center. Looking at Jake through the translucent icon, the general grinned deviously. Wait, Jake started. Before he could finish the protest, the general tossed the icon into the disembodied mind. An audible metallic pop rang from the point of impact. Concentric rings radiated across the holographic brain's surface. A sudden wave of nausea struck Jake as dizzying vertigo made him feel like the room was spinning. Jake grabbed the table with both hands. A strange tingling sensation flooded his head. As it passed, he blinked several times. That felt weird. Jake froze in shocked amazement. He'd spoken in the same strange tongue as Vic. Can you understand me now? Vic asked in the same language. Oh my God, that's amazing, he said through an unnerved laugh. Jake switched back to English. I can completely differentiate the two languages, he grinned widely, as if I've spoken them for my entire life. Looking at General Tannehill, Jake pointed to the holographic brain and the scrolling icons. Is that just for learning languages? Can it teach other subjects? The general smiled. There's way more than that. Want to learn Kung Fu, or at least the Argonian equivalent? Richard leaned over the table, pointing at the hologram. It's like the Matrix without a big hole in the back of your head. Head spinning from all the revelations, Jake felt both mentally exhausted and simultaneously exhilarated. The significance of what this meant for himself, his family, and his friends, hell, the entire world, was incredible. His grin never faltering, General Tannehill seemed to enjoy the flood of emotions and questions streaming across Jake's face. He imagined the general probably had the same reaction upon receiving his first briefing. Giddy with the possibilities, Jake nodded. Please continue, sir. How are we and the Argonians the same race? We don't know for sure. They've told us that some of their early colony ships disappeared, never to be heard from again. As I said earlier, it's a damn big galaxy. They theorize one may have been stranded here tens of thousands of years ago, although we have no idea what became of their technology or scientific knowledge. Apparently, they were close enough genetically to the Neanderthals to coexist. According to recent genetic discoveries, they did more than coexist, Richard added. Amazing, Jake whispered. Anyway, returning to the 1940s, the general said. After reporting their discovery, the scouts were ordered to proceed. Unfortunately, before they could make contact, there was a mishap. One of the scout ships encountered a severe thunderstorm over New Mexico and crashed. The general smiled and raised his eyebrows. An incident most referred to as Roswell. Jake sat bolt upright. Roswell was real? Yes, the general said. It was a freak accident. Guess it just goes to show, even though they've advanced significantly, they're still fallible humans. But why would they be in Roswell? That was before the Air Force split from the Army. Roswell Army Airfield was home to the 509th Bomber Group. It was an elite air wing, and at the time the only nuclear-armed military unit in the world. Also, it was only 110 miles from Trinity, the test site where we detonated our first nukes, Richard said. Go figure, Jake said. No wonder that was their first stop. Tannehill continued. The story has been altered and bastardized. However, many of the fundamental parts are true. The ship and its impact debris were collected. After several moves and several years, it ended up in an Area 51 hangar. Is it still there? No, it was eventually returned to the Argonians. But wait, Roswell happened in 1947, Jake said. I thought you said we got their attention in 1945. You're right, Captain. The Argonians' drive technology allows them to travel significantly faster than light, and their zero-width wormholes allow instant galactic-wide communications. However, the signals their passive sensors listen for are limited to the speed of light. A storm of dissociated points of light swirled overhead. After a moment, they coalesced into the Milkyway galaxy. Bent over the keyboard, the general tapped out another command. Standing, he pointed into the 20-foot-wide hologram as the tide of green dots spread through the image again. Even with more than 1 million equally spaced sensors, they are still 1,000 light-years apart. 1,000 light-years, Jake said in a dubious tone. Standing to his full 6 feet, his head was immersed in the hologram. As the slowly rotating galactic plane slid past, he eyed the spacing of the sensor grid with open skepticism. I'm sorry, sir, but that doesn't look like it could be anywhere close to 1,000 light-years. Walking toward the far end of the room, General Tannehill smiled and pulled a laser pointer from a shirt pocket. Activating it, he placed a red dot on the wall behind Jake. Move to the outer edge, Captain. With a final skeptical look at the grid floating through his vision, Jake ducked out of the hologram. He stepped to its far side and stood opposite the general. Through the translucent brilliance of the rendering, he could just make out the man's face. Without turning it on, Tannehill lifted the laser to eye level and aimed it at Jake's face. Okay, Captain, I just fired my laser light at you. There still wasn't any light coming from the device. Jake saw the general's point immediately. You're saying that it would take a long time for the light to travel across the galaxy. General Tannehill nodded and turned on the laser pointer. A very long time. In the real galaxy, that light would take 100,000 years to travel from me to you. With his opposite hand, he ran a finger through a region of the hologram that looked like flowing sand. Every pixel of this glowing dust is actually a star separated from its closest neighbor by light-years of empty space. Nodding, Jake stared in stunned comprehension. None of it was new information. However, The general's practical demonstration slammed home the galaxy scale in a way raw numbers never had. So it could have taken up to 500 years for them to detect us. The general grinned. Yep. It was pure happenstance that a sensor was less than 2 light years from our solar system. As they moved back to their chairs, Jake gave the general a contrite expression. Sorry for the skepticism, sir. Tannehill waved it off. You're not the first person I've given that little demonstration. Sitting down, he studied the table's embedded computer screen. Now, where were we? I think you were about to tell me what happened to the remaining Argonian scout ship. That's right, the general said, leaning back in his chair. It made first contact with the U.S. military. With the military? Why not the government, sir? The general shrugged. It's been their policy for thousands of years. They say it reduces the possibility of a hostile reception. Jake considered it and nodded. Guess it's better to talk to the armed husband at the front door before trying to sell his wife an encyclopedia set. Pretty much, General Tannehill agreed. So what were they trying to sell to the wife? As I mentioned, our galaxy has tens of thousands of worlds inhabited by thousands of species. The Argonians were the first star travelers. So over the millennia, they've helped hundreds of species at varying levels of technological development make the transition to starfaring status. Through trial and error, they established a regimented process of first contact and integration. This process allows newly discovered societies to be smoothly integrated into the galactic community while minimizing the short-term cultural and economic impact. In spite of our being the same race, they decided to follow the same procedure for our introduction into the galactic government and economy. The entire process is slated to take 75 Earth years. For us, that clock started around 1950. The technological advances scheduled for the next decade will make the last 60 years seem trivial by comparison. Obviously well-versed in the details of the briefing, the general continued with a practiced ease. The coming years will see the introduction of game-changing technologies. The biggest effects will be in the medical, communications, and energy sectors. Additionally, there will be more and more hints of the existence of extraterrestrial life. All of this is designed so that by the time the world becomes aware of the existence of aliens, we will have advanced enough to reduce the cultural shock, the general concluded. Why such a long process? Jake asked. Humanity is resilient. Surely they don't think we'll fall into anarchy the first time CNN televises a UFO landed in Central Park. The general nodded in understanding. They have to consider all of the potential ramifications of early disclosure. Initially, their first contact efforts garnered everything from smooth transitions to global civil wars. Over the subsequent millennia, they fine-tuned the process. Several factors determined the length of the transition. If our world economy had been globally aligned, and if energy trading weren't such an integral part of it, we would have had a shorter transition. Energy is the biggest sector of our global economy. Just imagine what would happen to the world markets if free energy was dropped on our doorstep tomorrow. Jake nodded in understanding. The millions of jobs and billions of dollars tied into all the steps between oil exploration, drilling, production, and distribution of petroleum products would be lost overnight. Exactly. And that's just one part, albeit a very big part, of the world economy. While 75 years sounds exceedingly long to us, when you consider it from their position and time scale, it's a blink of the eye. So what happened back in the 40s when they told the U.S. leadership about the galactic government and the 75-year process? Jake asked. Initially, there was a lot of reluctance and skepticism. Our military commanders were especially concerned with the requirement to include all of Earth's significant governments, especially the Soviets. The Argonians explained that the galactic economy was a hybrid of capitalism and socialism based on free trade. They also told them the process of bringing us into the fold would require a gradual transition of all Earth governments to a compatible economy. In other words, they were proposing changes that weren't going to be popular anywhere, Jake said. Pretty much, General Tannehill agreed. In January of 1948, the heads of state for all of Earth's significant countries were brought together and briefed by the commander of the remaining scout ship. The 75-year timeline and the reasons for it were laid out. As I'm sure you can imagine, there were serious objections from the communist nations. The scout commander pointed out that governments that chose to exclude themselves from the process would also be excluding themselves from the opportunities and technologies that would be realized during the undertaking. The communist delegations declined the invitation, insisting their superior governments and economies would achieve these goals on their own. They refused to be any part of it. Over the following decades, as the Cold War continued and the West prospered in the face of the failure of communism, the abstaining governments slowly came around. Jake nodded. So over the last couple of decades, we've witnessed the transition, he said. Raising a hand, he counted off the steps with his fingers. First, the fall of the Soviet Union, followed by the gradual transition of the Chinese economy, and then by the formation of the European Union and the United States' gradual increase in social programs, regardless of which party was in power. Yep, you're connecting the dots. Today, all of Earth's significant countries are in the loop. We're well on the road to galactic government integration, concluded the general. Thank you, sir. That definitely answers a lot of my questions, Jake said, looking at both of his friends, then focused on Lieutenant Croft. It's damn good to see you alive and well, Lieutenant. Victor squirmed under the attention. You're telling me, he finally managed as he stared down at the desk. That reminded Jake of another bothersome issue. He turned back to General Tannehill. Actually, sir, there is one more thing. I don't understand why the ship caused problems with our fighters. If it could interfere with our aircraft, why didn't they keep their distance? Richard nodded. I've got this, sir, he said. The Argonians use a gravity drive and inertial dampening system. It generates a field that simultaneously moves all matter within its effective range. The field's envelope extends several meters outside of the ship. Since all of the molecules within it move together, any object or person within the field won't feel G-forces or acceleration. For instance, the reason you feel G-forces as your Corvette accelerates from 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds is due to Newton's law of inertia. The molecules in your chest want to stay in place, while the molecules in your back are being pushed forward by the power of the engine. Now imagine you could pull all of those molecules simultaneously. There would be no compression due to inertia. You would literally feel no G-forces at all. Sitting back, Jake envisioned the ship plowing through the atmosphere, trying to visualize its effect on the surrounding air. That explains the buffeting Vic's F-22 experienced as the ship closed in. Since the effect extends beyond the ship's external skin, there must be a pocket of air dragged along by the ship's drive. When it got too close to Vic's wing, it lost lift, causing it to stall out. Makes for one hell of a rough ride, Lieutenant Croft said. Yeah, but that brings me back to my original problem. Knowing this, why would the Argonian pilot allow his ship to get close enough to cause problems? I'll take this one, Captain, General Tannehill said. He nodded to Jake and Vic with a contrite expression. Quite frankly, gentlemen, we screwed up. And by we, I mean I. He tapped another string of commands into the keyboard. Leaning back in his seat, the general continued. There was a meeting scheduled with the Argonians that morning. We have F-22s assigned as escorts. They are shielded against the gravity drive's effect. A hologram of an F-22 flying in formation with an Argonian ship materialized over the table. Rendered as a magenta fog, a bubble of energy completely encapsulated the Argonian ship just as Jake had envisioned. As it neared the holographic F-22, pulsing concentric arcs radiated from 2 points on the side of the fighter. They appeared to blow back the gravity drive's effect, creating a concave dimple in the Argonian ship's bubble. Tannehill continued. Unfortunately, due to a simple scheduling error, an error I failed to catch, the assigned F-22s were late for the meetup. The same error allowed you and Vic to be vectored into the area designated for the rendezvous. When the Argonian commander detected your fighters, he mistook you as his escort to the meeting location. Richard chimed in. The shielding is also necessary for your electronics. The gravity field affects your electrical lines and equipment, much like a spinning, hugely powerful magnet. The gravitonic flux lines cut across unshielded lines in a way that drains all electricity. Jake nodded to Richard and turned to Tannehill. Thank you for your frankness, General. So where do we sign up? Excuse me? Jake spread his arms wide, palms up. Well, it seems to me you could have forgotten all of this, sworn us to secrecy, shipped us off to Iceland, and written the whole thing off. So, sir, I'm thinking you have something better planned for us. Captain Allison told me you were a smart fella. Actually, I told him you were a pretty fart smeller, Richard quipped. Following hours of weighty discussion, Richard's joke brought a welcome levity. As the laughter settled, General Tannehill continued. Captain Allison's assertion notwithstanding, I do believe we have a place for the two of you in our program, if you'd be so inclined. Chapter 6. Commodore Salith charged the weapon and prepared to drop the ship out of parallel space, growled Lord Thraxed. As you command, Lord, the younger officer replied. Rising from an inadequate half-bow, Thraxed's second-in-command forwarded the orders to the appropriate stations. Pretending to ignore the slight, Thraxed impatiently stared into the main display. Ahead, their light curved into a sphere by the parallel space drive's faster-than-light velocity. The compressed starfield shone with the brilliance of 1,000,000 suns. Without the ship's shielding and light filters, the hard radiation streaming from the sphere would incinerate flesh and char the naked bones to dust in seconds. Outside of that ball of light, all was black. As they burned their way into Argonian space at superluminal speed, they traveled too fast for the light of the stars abreast and astern of their position to reach them. Illuminated by the light ahead, only the other ships of his fleet broke the impenetrable inky void. Agitated, Thraxed dug a razor-sharp talon into the damp, rough rock armset of his black stone throne. The design and atmosphere of the hollowed-out iron asteroids that formed the ship mimicked the damp interior of their homeworld cave dwellings. The environmental control system maintained the humidity level at 100%. However, even the constant sound of dripping water that echoed through the spaceship's interior brought Thraxed no comfort. A low, rumbling growl rattled deep in the chest of the ancient warrior posted on his right. The wizened old Zoxith was Raja Fasir, Lord Thraxed's most trusted advisor and oldest friend. The Lord's razor-sharp scaled lips parted in a toothy grin. His pointed black tongue danced across silver fangs. In a hissing voice, backed by a deep rumble that originated from the same depths as his confidant's growl, Thraxed spoke in words only the Raja could hear. "What is it, Fasir?" The Raja's scarred arm rose. In menacing agitation, the old warrior's razor-sharp, sickle-shaped dew-claw talon repeatedly slid in and out of his forearm. Extending a grizzled finger at Commodore Salith, Fasir turned to face Thraxed. "That one thinks his time draws near." Thraxed regarded the remaining eye of his old friend's mutilated face. It burned with anger. Having sworn a life oath to protect the Lord, Fasir looked ready to attack the young Commodore. Even the polished rock he'd bolted into the socket of his gouged-out right eye appeared to scowl. In spite of his age, the Raja was second only to Thraxed in size and physical stature. Turning to scowl at the Commodore, Raja Fasir's eye slits narrowed. "My lord, let me take the hatchling down a notch." Thraxed's grin widened. "Do not worry, old friend. I can handle this one." He paused with a deep, low laugh. "Actually, he reminds me of myself." "Yes, exactly," Fasir said. He turned his sole eye on Thraxed. A toothy smile parted the old warrior's scaled lips. "So let us not forget how you rose to this station." Thraxed wrapped the thumb and 3 talons of his right hand around the Raja's upper left arm and pulled him down to a knee. He gripped the old warrior so tightly the dagger tips of Thraxed's steel-reinforced talons pricked green blood. "I never forget, old friend." Fasir bowed his head deeply. "Forgive me, my lord." Releasing his arm, Thraxed gave the warrior a respectful nod and gestured toward Salith. "The day I stop heeding your words will be the day that hatchling deserves this seat." He tapped steel-tipped talons on the throne's damp rock surface, depositing small drops of Fasir's green blood. Paying no heed to the fresh wounds, the Raja nodded and stood. Leaning back into his black throne, the huge and menacing Zoxith Lord scanned the bridge of the dark warship Tidor Droff. It was dark times in the Zoxith Empire. The recent radical reversal of fortunes had the High Council questioning Thrax's decision to press the battle beyond Zoxith space. In the early days, their war to purge the Arconian infestation had succeeded beyond all expectations. After their original successes, the Zoxith High Council had pressed their Lord of War to sue for peace, not to take the battle beyond the Forebearers' ancestral borders. Thrax had even considered it. Then the Argonians had done the unthinkable. Looking through the Forebearers' left eye port, Thrax studied the dreadnought flying on his left flank. As with the Tidor Droff, it was a giant conglomeration of hollowed iron asteroids held together by steel superstructures. Like all ships in his fleet, the bridge at the front of the ship was a massive bust of a Forebearer's head chiseled from a dedicated asteroid. The combination of natural and unnatural structures and the power their mass signified were designed to strike fear into all who ventured within its sphere of influence, a sphere Lord Thrax intended to extend today. Gesturing for Fasir to look at the bridge of the adjacent dreadnought, Thrax pointed at the sculptured Argonian skull clenched in the Forebearer's stone fangs. "This weapon will bring the bastards to their knees." The ancient Raja bowed respectfully. "You will have your vengeance, my lord. Oh, they will pay. I will avenge." Lost in the memory, Thrax gnashed his silvery teeth and dug the steel-tipped middle talon of his right hand into the armrest again. Black and rough, its damp rock surface reminded him of his grotto back on Zoxia. He'd loved coming home to her, her scent, the sound of her and their sons cooing. He longed for her touch. The image dissolved, chased away by fire and a woman's death screech. Clawing at the stone floor with his lower steel-tipped talons, Thrax stood. The massive scaled muscles of his legs flexed and rippled. Standing to his full 8-foot height, he stepped to the center of the bridge. His imposing bulk filled the arena between his black throne and the forward bank of consoles. Stepping forward, Fasir stood to the Lord's right rear. Thrax nodded at him and then faced forward. His black tongue ran across dripping fangs. "Ready to deploy," reported Commodore Saleth, this time his bow non-existent. Lord Thrax's long, sinuous arm struck so quickly that the movement was almost imperceptible. Commodore Saleth fell to a knee, clutching his bleeding face. "Do not forget your place, Commodore, or next time I may forget to retract my arm talon," said Lord Thrax. Lowering his hands, Saleth bowed deeply and backed away from the towering Zoxith leader. "Forgive me, Lord. It was not my intent to disrespect." In a final display of servility, the ambitious officer's swept-back, horn-shaped ears lay flat against the hunter-green scales of his angular skull. Thrax gave him a curt nod. "Transmit this to the entire ship." "Yes, my lord," Saleth said. After a respectful bow, he forwarded the order to the officer standing at the communications console. The Lord was pleased to see his protégé shake off the pain. Not waiting for confirmation, Thrax turned and walked back to his rock throne. Standing in front of his high perch, he addressed the fleet. 100,000 years ago, when the Argonian infestation first ventured out of their solar system, they found us holding the galactic keys. They attacked us then, as they do today. Following our near genocide during the War of Argonian Aggression, the Forebearers were forced into an unholy alliance. The aggressors doled out crumbs of power. Strung along by the Argonians, we were told that our representation in their galactic government made us equal partners in the galactic community, Thrax said, spitting out the words equal and community with unbridled disgust, hatred, and contempt. Now that we fight for independence, they again seek to genocide us. A cacophony of angry growls and indignant screeches echoed through the cavernous ship. Nodding his massive head, Lord Thrax continued his tirade. Making the ultimate sacrifice, many great warriors have since joined the Forebearers. In spite of heavy losses, it is only through their brave efforts that the Argonians have yet to re-enter Zoxith space. As during that first war, their advanced technology turned our early successes into a chain of defeats. Angry rumblings passed through the ship. For millennia, the Zoxith Empire had struggled to understand Argonian technology. Complicating the issue, their genetic security protocols had blocked Zoxith efforts to reverse engineer captured ships. If you don't have Argonian genetics, the systems resist all attempts at discovery, self-destructing if probed too deeply. Their ship's semi-sentient intelligence could also differentiate between living and dead tissue, as well as free will versus coerced cooperation, thus thwarting efforts to gain access using cadavers and prisoners. Thraxed continued his rant. The Argonians arrogantly assume their technology renders the outcome of this war a foregone conclusion. This weapon will turn the tide. The gods of war will see our dreadnoughts rain death upon all opposing our rightful ascension to the galactic seat of power. The Argonians will beg for our mercy, proclaimed Lord Thraxed. The steel-reinforced talons in his clawed feet scratched at the floor while he thrusts a clenched fist into the rock ceiling, sending out a spray of shattered stones. With this weapon, we will chase the Argonian infestation from the very galaxy. In answer, his warriors raised their arms as their roars joined his. Thraxed pointed at his second-in-command. Commodore Salith, after this test, your dreadnought fleet will be the first to attack an Argonian star system. Grinning through green blood, Commodore Salith bowed sharply. Thank you, my lord. It will be the highest honor to visit the Forebearer's vengeance upon the Argonians. With a nod, Lord Thraxed sat in his cathedra. Very well, Commodore. Your command ship will be renamed as the Forebearer's Revenge. I know you'll earn their gratitude. Thank you, Lord, Salith said, returning to his station. Thraxed sat. Now it is time to introduce the Argonians to their fate. Drop only this ship out of parallel space. As planned, the dreadnought dropped back into regular space amongst a large formation of mismatched, decrepit spaceships. Like an angry nest of flies, the refugee ships scattered. Exactly as Thraxed had hoped, some turned to attack, while others fled for the perceived safety of distance. After waiting for the fleeing ships to gain adequate space to test the weapon's full range, Thraxed pointed to Commander Salith. Fire! Chapter 7. Admiral Ashtara Takama studied the myriad stars that filled the infinite space beyond his stateroom. Usually, the tranquil view from his private quarters provided the fleet admiral a reprieve from the daily stress and clutter of command. Today, it only served as a reminder of all that was wrong with the universe. Frustrated and irritated, the leader of the Galactic Defense Force turned away from the panorama. Behind him, the clear, variable-phase polymetallic wall opaqued, taking on a dark-stained wood finish. The Argonia-born commander of the United Galactic Federation's defense forces accessed his electro-organic network. Feeding data directly into his visual cortex, the self-assembling nanites of the EON superimposed icons over his view of the real world. Demanding his attention, one of the symbols hovering in his peripheral vision oscillated between amber and red. It was a report he'd already read. Due to the urgency of the message, the Admiral hadn't removed the flag. Sitting down, Takama tapped the icon with his virtual hand. Scanning the intelligence officer's report for the third time, he considered its implications. Damn it! A swipe of his virtual hand wiped the report from Takama's synthetic vision. 2 annoying red and amber flashes later, he double-tapped its icon and removed the flag. Still finding no solace, he shut down the EON's synthetic vision, leaving him an unobstructed view of his office. From behind his antique ornate bronze desk, Admiral Takama studied the collection of ancient battle implements that hung on the wall to his right. His gaze shifted to the central 2 revolvers hanging in opposition. One was from an age lost in Argonian antiquity. Barely 100 years old, the other was much newer. while only a narrow gap separated their muzzles. 100,000 years and half a galaxy hung between their inceptions. Independently developed by two isolated branches of the Argonian race, the weapons symbolized the base nature of the species, a nature Takama had believed was long in their past. However, the news contained in the report had his blood boiling. In spite of a lifetime immersed in an empathetic society, he would love to have thraxed in the iron sights of both pistols. 100 millennia ago, when the Argonians first ventured outside of the home system, they ran headlong into the burgeoning Zoxith Empire. Having subjugated every sentient species they encountered, the Zoxith had already established a serious superiority complex. When they came across the Argonians, the first technologically advanced species they'd encountered, the Zoxith attacked. The aggressive reptiles had expanded their empire beyond the boundary of their solar system as quickly as their nascent spacefaring technology afforded it. However, the Argonian race didn't spread outside of its home system until the virtual immortality afforded by their medical and technological advancements created the need for additional resources and real estate. Consequently, humanity's ancestors more than held their own against the antagonistic Zoxith, soundly defeating them in that first engagement. However, believing there was plenty of real estate for both, the Argonians disengaged. To avoid future confrontation, they shifted their exploration and colonization efforts away from the Zoxith Empire's territory. Spurned by their first defeat and unwilling to accept the growth of another empire on their border, the Zoxith took the battle to the Argonian homeworld. When an armada of their asteroid ships dropped out of parallel space above Argonia, the planet's inhabitants unleashed a counterattack that killed every reptilian combatant. To ensure Zoxith rulers got the message loud and clear, the Argonian defense forces went on an offensive sweep and vaporized every Zoxith ship between Argonia and the self-declared neutral zone. It turned out that the only thing the Zoxith respected was force. An uneasy peace settled between the two species. Over the subsequent millennia, the Argonians encountered a multitude of other spacefaring species without repeating the calamitous events of that first contact. They allied with several alien races and eventually set up a galactic free trade zone. By the time of the forming of the first galactic government, the Zoxith had joined the zone. They even assigned a representative to the newly formed Galactic Senate. From the early days of the United Galactic Federation, the Zoxith were a constant thorn in Argonia's side. However, in spite of their antagonistic posturing, the Zox remained a productive contributing member of the galactic community during the intervening millennia. In recent decades, a wave of religious fundamentalism had swept through the Zoxith sector. Ancestor-worshipping fanatics elevated the Zoxith that had originally attacked Argonia to sacrosanct deities. The worshippers' maniacal leader, Lord Thraxed, citing the documented destruction of one of the forebearers' massive egg-carrier colony ships, claimed they had narrowly avoided genocide in what he called the War of Argonian Aggression. According to Thraxed, the Argonians had forced peace terms and drawn the forebearers into an unholy alliance through lies and deceit. 2 years ago, fanatical followers of Lord Thraxed seized control of the Zoxith Empire and declared their independence from the United Galactic Federation. Subsequently, state-sponsored attacks and seizures fell on ships traveling through Zoxith space. What started out as harassment actions soon escalated to outright rebellion. A GDF cruiser disappeared when it went into Zoxith space to investigate an Argonian outpost that had fallen silent. Then the pair of Galactic Defense Force scout ships sent to find the cruiser disappeared as well. In a recon-in-force action, the Galactic Forge battlecruiser and space cruiser Deliverance dropped out of parallel space a light second from the last reported coordinates of the missing cruisers. Within seconds, over 100 of the massive Zoxith asteroid dreadnoughts materialized around the two warships. They were surrounded. The ensuing battle left thousands dead on both sides. Against Takama's recommendation, the leadership of the Galactic Federation recalled all GDF outposts and vacated all United Galactic Federation facilities within Zoxith space. Essentially, they allowed the Zox to secede from the UGF without negotiations or accountability for their unwarranted attacks. Admiral Ashtara Takama told the council the Zocs would see the move as weakness. Unfortunately, they proved him correct all too soon. Within days of the recall order, swarms of asteroidal dreadnoughts began attacking settlements outside Zoxith space. Somehow, the Zocs had secretly amassed an enormous fleet. That was 2 years ago. While the Zoxith initially had major victories, the last few months had seen the tide of war shift inexorably in favor of the Galactic Defense Force. Once the Council fully appreciated the scope of the Zoxith threat, they had thrown the full force of the Argonian Galactic Defense Force into battle. Takama, his hands untied, had swept the Zox infestation from every system outside of Zoxith space. Since the last engagement, 2 months previous, an uneasy ceasefire had settled across the region. As both sides regarded each other across stagnant battle lines, refugees had begun repopulating the liberated planets. While the United Galactic Federation contained thousands of species, there had been little blending of populations. With a few notable exceptions near the galactic core, the denizens of most colonized worlds consisted of one species. The radically differing atmospheric and gravitational standards rendered cross-species cohabitation a near impossibility. The subsequent genetic polarization carried across many aspects of the galactic community. To simplify environmental systems and to prevent proliferation of weapon technologies, the Argonians maintained sole control of the Galactic Defense Force. While they often worked hand in hand with other races, only Argonians staffed the fleet's warships. Superficially, it sounded xenophobic and had been called as much by the Zoxith. However, over the millennia, the GDF had earned a reputation as a force for good. Whether providing disaster relief or coming to the rescue of an embattled ally, the Argonians of the Galactic Defense Force were goodwill ambassadors and the glue that held the United Galactic Federation together. Following the cessation of hostilities, great convoys of returning refugees now streamed back into the border worlds. The mission of the GDF had shifted from offensive to defensive as they provided protection to the various species re-entering the zone. Now there was a problem. Admiral Takama closed his eyes for a moment. Sitting back in his chair, he reactivated his EON and accessed the disturbing report again. It was from a unit assigned to escort duty. Prior to linking up with that military escort, and still well outside the border region, a fleet of Argonian refugees preparing to return to their liberated colony world had come under attack. The distress call cut off midstream, but not before reporting a sole Zoxith dreadnought. The escort squadron had leapt into parallel space in a mad rush to come to their defense. What they found at the last reported position of the refugee fleet sent a chill down Takama's spine. In the hour it took the squadron to close the 4-light-year gap, the dreadnought blasted and burned all the ships of the Argonian convoy and made its escape. In spite of the fleet's extensive destruction, there should have been some survivors, or bodies, or something other than what they'd found. Or not found in this case. Every ship remnant and cinder they'd searched was devoid of any Argonians, alive or dead. Chapter 8. The late spring sun beat down on the Nevada tarmac like a never-ending nuclear detonation. In spite of the lengthening late-afternoon shadows, the high desert sky retained the deep blue hue of a midsummer day. The surrounding mountains would look at home on the moon, their rocky peaks scratched roughly at the lighter edges of the azure overarching atmospheric ocean. Forming an unbroken halo, they guarded Area 51's secret Groom Lake Air Force Base from prying eyes. Chasing their elongated, ambling shadows, 2 Air Force officers walked in front of a long row of hangars. In the base's ghost town silence, their footsteps echoed off the metal sides of the large buildings. As they progressed east toward an expansive aircraft ramp, each hangar appeared to be older than the previous. "I always thought when I became a super-secret special agent, I wouldn't have to sweat anymore," Jake said to Vic. "Yeah," Vic said. Casting a resigned glance at the blazing sun, he fanned the zipper-lined lapel of his flight suit. "It's like stepping into an oven." They had just finished their first week at the officially non-existent military base. The security briefings and safety classes had been exhausting and mind-numbing. The secretive and compartmentalized policies of the facility prohibited discussion of their assignments or job duties with their instructors, a fact driven home by ubiquitous signage and incessant oral security reminders blasted from an overhead public address system. As far as Jake knew, the instructors had no idea of the not-so-alien aliens or any of the myriad unknowable projects currently operating at the base. Wiping a fresh bead of sweat from his brow, Jake scanned the expansive concrete plain. From here, it appeared they were walking through an abandoned airfield. He knew most activities took place in a vast underground web. Their briefings had been in a small part of that network. One of the orientations had alluded to an intricate maze of tunnels connecting various facilities. This trek to the flight line was their first foray beyond the administration area. "Those were vague instructions," Victor said, breaking Jake's thoughts. "I know. Considering how anal they are here, being told to walk to the end of the hangars and wait seems, I don't know, loose, I guess." "I know. I keep waiting to see security police running at us, guns drawn," Vic said. His hand pointed at Jake's head, pistol style. Jake winced as the gesture reminded him of the events that followed their disastrous UFO encounter. "Oops. Sorry." Vic lowered his arm and grinned. "I had it rough too, you know." "Yeah, right. You get gently floated from your fighter. I get yanked down and tossed unceremoniously face first onto the tarmac. You're taken to a nice, plush facility and fed tea and crumpets. I'm taken to an interrogation room and berated for 12 hours, and I'm the one left feeling guilty," he said through a sardonic grin. Vic looked dejected. "Sorry. Dude, I'm just messing with you." Jake punched him in the arm. "Time to put on your big girl panties, Lieutenant." Rubbing his shoulder, Vic smiled self-consciously. Stopping next to the last hangar, they looked around, unsure of what to do next. When they had received their instruction, Vic had asked, "Wait for what?" The instructor merely shrugged his shoulders. They'd encountered the gesture so many times the two officers called it the Area 51 salute. "These hangars look like they've been here since the—" Vic stopped as a black Hummer zipped from behind the building. "Well, I'll be a son of a—" Jake said through a startled chuckle. The vehicle slid to a stop in front of them. "Are you ladies just going to stand there all slack-jawed?" Captain Richard Allison asked. "I was wondering when your lame ass would show up," Jake said. "Go to hell," Richard said through a grin. Wiping more sweat from his brow, Jake glanced at the sun hovering over the western mountains. "I think we're already there." Richard gestured to the sweat stains adorning his own flight suit. "I hear you, brother." "It's good to see you," Vic said as he and Jake climbed into the Hummer. "We've seen nothing but admin types all week." "Well, it's time for that to change. I'm here to show you the meat and potatoes of the operation." While speaking, he pulled onto the flight line and headed toward the runway complex. Jake studied the maze of tarmac, taxiways, and concrete runways. "I know more about the layout of this place from what I saw on Google Earth than I learned from all the briefings we suffered through." He pointed ahead. "For instance, from what I saw in their imagery, I know those are some of the longest runways in the world. A few extending well into Groom Lake's dry bed to the north." As Richard pulled onto a ramp linked to one of the main runways, Victor pointed at a jet blast shield in front of a low, flat hill. "There's a familiar structure." "Yep," Jake agreed. "There's been at least one at every Air Force base I've been to." Positioned behind an area designated as a jet ground run area, the blast shield worked like giant louvers. The curved overlapping slats diverted a jet's exhaust away from the ground. "Not like this one," Richard said, turning south toward the structure. Jake studied the metal panels. Airport planners usually positioned them in front of buildings or roads. However, this shield was cut into the side of rising terrain. As they approached, the shield began to lift and fold horizontally, revealing a large hangar hidden in the mound. "That's not a natural hill," Jake said. "It looks like the hangar was built and then covered in earth." "Bet you didn't see that on Google Earth," Richard said through a smile. As he pulled the Hummer through the opening, the blast shield-clad hangar doors lowered. Within, Jake discovered it lacked a few of the necessary fixtures to qualify it as a hangar. No hoists, offices, or ancillary equipment adorned its well-lit interior. They were in a huge metal box, big as a hangar, just not equipped as such. Just as Jake and Vic opened their mouths to comment, a deep clunking noise sprang from the box's metallic walls. A tremor shook the Hummer. After a few moments, Jake sensed vertical motion. "We're descending?" Richard nodded. "The upper levels we're passing through are used for projects too sensitive to use the above-ground hangars. The lower we go, the more sensitive the project." "Guess we're heading to the bottom," Jake said. "As far as I know, but as far as the crews and the floors above us know, they are the lowest and most secret project here." Pointing to the wall ahead, Richard continued. "Each level has its own blast and soundproof door separating it from the lift. In addition to their normal functions, they prevent prying eyes from seeing or hearing more than they should." "Need to know and all that," Vic said. "Compartmentalization," Jake said. "Gotta love it. Sometimes I wonder if any one person knows everything that happens here." Richard nodded. "With all the military branches, plus the CIA, NSA, and who knows how many other A's," he shrugged, letting the Area 51 salute finish his sentence. "As you already know, your ID badge contains a tiny radio frequency or RF chip that allows access to your authorized facilities. The lift works the same way. Approach, and it opens. Enter, and it takes you to your assigned level." As Richard finished, the lift came to a gentle stop. Another clunk echoed through the box as the door ahead lifted open. In the topless Hummer, Richard grabbed the upper frame of the windshield and pulled himself out of his seat. Sitting on the driver's seat back, he spread his arms wide over the windshield with an exaggerated flourish. "Gentlemen, I present Earth's most advanced fleet." Chapter 9. Hurtling past damp, rough, black stone, Lord Thraxed stomped down the hallway. Bursting onto the bridge, he glowered at the busy officers as they monitored Commodore Saleth's fleet preparations for the coming light jump. Growling, Thraxed pointed at the communications officer. "Remind the young Commodore to have his ships disable their drive suppressors," his deep voice thundered, more felt than heard. "Yes, Lord," replied the officer, forwarding the order. "Commodore Saleth confirms drive level set to 5 and drive suppressors off, my lord." "Excellent. I wouldn't want him to get there too early, and if they're too quiet, the Argonians might miss the party." Through the bridge's view wall, he watched Commodore Saleth's attack party move into formation for the light jump to Sector 64. Like his command ship, the dreadnoughts were a combination of natural and artificial structures. Engineered asteroids cobbled together by massive superstructures, their menacing appearance brought terror to all those unfortunate enough to cross them. Except for the sculpted bridge section, the asteroids maintained their natural, rough, cratered rocky exterior, while the Zoxoformed interior was engineered to provide a Zoxith atmosphere and climate. The Zoxoforming also fashioned bays for systems, weapons, and personnel. The ship's rocky, jutting angles formed jagged silhouettes interspersed with smooth, glistening metal of the connecting superstructures. Thraxed scanned the nearest ship, Commodore Saleth's newly renamed command ship, the Forebearer's Revenge. Glowing green portals interrupted the patchwork of rock and alloy. Shadows moved across ports as warriors within hastened about, performing their assigned pre-jump tasks. At the allotted time, Saleth's ships appeared to wink out of existence as his fleet slipped into parallel space. Thrax's talons anxiously scratched at the floor. Drool dripped from his gleaming, gnarled teeth as he salivated at the thought of feasting upon his soon-to-be-defeated enemies. Happy hunting, Commodore. Chapter 10. Studying the object of her concern, Sandy ran a hand across her flat stomach. From its perch on a bed of perfectly folded toilet paper, the pregnancy test stick sat like a religious offering waiting for an Indiana Jones wannabe to scoop it up. After another glance at her washboard abs, she dissolved into a fit of laughter. The comic book mental image of her round, pregnant body rolling down the cavern, chasing the idol snatcher from her own Temple of Doom, was more than Sandy's hormonally charged emotions could contain. Just as quickly as it started, the laughter morphed into silent tears. Shit! Sitting on the closed toilet, she continued through her full library of choice curse words. Muffled by the hands cradling her face, her diatribe sounded like Charlie Brown's schoolteacher in the midst of a Tourette syndrome-fueled meltdown. Her profanity reserves tapped, she sat in silence. Placing tear-soaked hands in her lap, Sandy stared at the ceiling. She took a deep, calming breath. Letting it out in a long exhalation, she looked at her phone on the vanity top. Picking it up, Sandy turned it on. Jake's goofy grin stared back from the phone's screen. She nodded her head toward the pea-stick. "What are you going to think about this little tidbit of news, mister?" After a moment, she pressed the send button. Without ringing, the call went direct to voicemail. "Hi, this is Jake. I'm either fly in or do something really important, so you know what to do." After the phone beeped, Sandy said, "Hey, babe, it's me. Give me a call when you get in. I miss you, Mr. Mysterious." Ending the call, she stared into his eyes. "What are you guys up to?" In the 2 weeks since he'd returned from D.C., Jake had been very tight-lipped about what happened. His whole attitude had changed overnight. He'd left dejected and confused and returned happy and confident. The return of Victor was incredible news. Outside of the major that had interrogated him, Sandy was the only person Jake told about the loss of his wingman. So she was the only one wondering what had happened to Vic that night. All Jake would say was that they'd stumbled into a highly classified program. A wall of secrecy had slammed down over the whole situation. Also, the two disappeared each day. When she tried to call either of their phones, it went straight to voicemail. She looked at her watch. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. "Where the hell are you, Jake?" Chapter 11. From the Hummer's front passenger seat in the giant elevator, Jake watched the slow rise of the secret hangar's folding steel blast doors. As the horizontal field of view expanded vertically, two recognizable sets of landing gear came into sight. "Are those shielded F-22s? Richard nodded. The door continued to rise, revealing the sleek, stealthy black fighters resting on the gear. The hangar beyond bustled with activity as personnel of various specialties scurried about. While Jake wasn't surprised by the two F-22 Raptors parked diagonally along the left wall, he was shocked to see the UFO he and Vic had encountered parked beyond the fighters in the hangar's back left corner. "What the hell?" he said, turning to look at Vic and Richard. Vic's shocked face mirrored Jake's thoughts. Grinning, Richard said, "No, it's not the one you two encountered. However, mine weapons system sits the same." Dropping back into the driver's seat, Richard edged the Hummer into the hangar. Easing past the Raptors, he headed straight for the alien ship. Peeling his eyes from the spaceship to look at the F-22s, Jake noticed a couple of unfamiliar antennas. 4 oval depressions with short metal rods protruding from their centers adorned each fighter. 2 left and 2 right, they looked like side-facing oblong aerodynamic satellite dishes. Jake pointed at the devices. "Do those shield the fighters from the ship's gravity drive?" Richard nodded. "They project a negative waveform that cancels out the gravity wave." Jake considered the concept. "Like noise-canceling headphones dampen sound waves?" "Exactly," he said. "Within the area where the two fields interface, the two sine waves, 180 degrees out of phase, nullify each other." Nodding, Jake turned back to the strange ship as Richard pulled to a stop in front of it. Stepping from the vehicle in reverent silence, they moved to stand side by side facing the ship. Its dark metallic curved surface was perfectly smooth. The skin had no angles or edges. It looked as if it had flowed into its present shape. "It's like looking at a dark mirror made from black mercury," Vic said. "Yeah," Jake said. "I can see the Hummer's reflection, but barely." Bending at the waist, he squinted at the image. "The headlights look black. It's like the skin is absorbing the light. The way it absorbs the brighter light more than the dimmer makes it look like a photo negative," Vic said. Richard nodded again. "The skin actively absorbs incoming energy, making it virtually undetectable in all but the visible spectrum. So that's why I couldn't see it on my infrared scope, Jake said. And why our threat radar never went off, Victor said. But it looks cool. Yes, it does. I've worked with it for 6 months now, and I'm still fascinated every time I see it, Richard said. Jake stood, silently taking it in. The ship was much taller than the fighters, and a little wider than they were long. Disc-shaped, it looked tall enough for at least 2 internal levels. The flattened conical top flowed seamlessly into the ship's vertical side about 5 feet above a central horizontal bulge. The semicircular protuberance was about 3 feet wide. Richard stepped up to a pedestal mounted to the floor between them and the ship. After entering a couple of commands into the computer mounted on its top, he returned to their side. Jake felt more than heard a deep hum emanate from the ship as a horizontal, multicolored pulsing ring of energy emerged from and began to rotate above the ship's equatorial bulge. "That's the lights we saw," Vic said in an awed tone. "The ship generates a rotating energy field the Argonians manipulate to maneuver the ship. The only energy we've been able to detect with our sensors is in the visible light spectrum. In other words, just what we're looking at." "Visible light only? No other radiation?" Jake asked. "Well, none we can detect." "Are you sure we're safe this close to it?" Victor asked, with a nervous step back. "Yes, the Argonians promise it's completely safe." Jake nodded, entranced by the ethereal lights floating only 2 feet overhead. "How does it work?" "Basically, that central bulge contains a spinning magnetic ring with an oscillating quantum field. The column Victor saw in the ship's center is a powerful superconducting coil. The strength of the coil's field, coupled with the ring's incredibly high RPM, creates a powerful and tunable anti-gravity force." "How does a ring spinning in one plane create a bubble that surrounds a 3-dimensional ship?" Jake asked. "Varying the quantum oscillation transmutes the ring's polarity, changing the angle it cuts through the coil's horizontal field. RPM variations modulate its vertical component." "Okay. Well, that was all Greek to me," Victor said. Jake tried to visualize how a ring rotating on a horizontal plane could have an effect in the vertical plane. In a flash of insight, he said, "So, oscillating the quantum field adds a vertical component to the horizontally spinning ring's field. It creates a second virtual ring that is omniaxial and omnirotational." "Huh?" Victor asked with a bewildered look. Jake looked at him and turned back to Richard with mock exasperation. "Lieutenants. Can't take 'em anywhere. Hey, I was a psych major, not psychics like you two." "Just kidding, buddy," Jake said. "To put it in layman's terms, if you had a pair of goggles that could see the force Richard is describing, you would see a cocoon of rings spinning around this ship. They'd be spinning and tumbling in every direction," Richard added. Nodding, starting to catch on, he asked, "Where does the light come from?" "I was going to ask that too, but the forces you're describing sound familiar. I read an article about a theory that works something like this," Jake said, pointing at the ring of light. "If I'm right, those are called gravitophotons." "I thought you might pick up on that," Richard said, shaking his head with an impressed grin. Gravito-what-ons?" "Gravitophotons," Jake said. "The article I read was about some new work a group of theoretical physicists are doing with an old theory." "Old?" "Yep, as in 1950s and 60s. It's called Heim quantum theory." "You mean somebody on Earth figured this stuff out 50 years ago?" Vic asked. "Why haven't I heard about it?" "Well, the theory was created by an obscure, self-taught German physicist named Burkhard Heim. This guy was a true genius. In an effort to get around the limitations of chemical rockets, he came up with a modified quantum theory. His equations could predict both the position and energy state of a quantum particle, a feat no one can duplicate, even today. It's something quantum physics tells us can't be done," Richard added. He claimed it successfully bridged the gap between quantum physics and Einstein's general relativity. "Okay, so, again, why doesn't the whole world know this guy's name?" And most physicists of the day dismissed him. His work, all in German, was very arcane. However, some of the Germans working on America's rocket program knew of him, and greatly respected his work. It is rumored that Werner von Braun even approached him in the early 1960s asking if they should shelve their work on chemical rockets. Wait, how does a unifying theory nullify the need for chemical rockets? His theory postulated that if you spin a large, extremely powerful magnet through a hugely powerful electric field, you will generate gravity waves. Turning to Richard with a meaningful look, he added, he also postulated those waves would manifest a new, previously unknown particle, graviphotons. Pointing both hands toward the ring of lights, Richard said, "Ta-da! If the ship is cocooned in these rings, why don't we see lights all over the ship?" Jake started to open his mouth. Reconsidering, he turned to Richard. "That's a good question. They're only generated where the virtual rings cross the physical ring." Jake nodded. "The oscillating quantum field causes the color variances while its spin imparts the rotational aspect." "Exactly," Richard said, obviously excited by the subject. "The anti-gravity field has another beneficial effect." "What's that?" "It decouples 99.9% the mass of everything within the field's influence from the space surrounding it, enabling the instantaneous course changes you saw without crushing its occupants." Jake shook his head. "How could it do that?" "It decouples the ship from the Higgs field." "The God particle?" Victor asked. The final piece fell into place for Jake. "So the anti-gravity wave creates a quantum bubble that shields everything in it from the Higgs field." "Almost all of it. They had to leave that tiny fraction of a percent, otherwise it would turn photonic and move at the speed of light until the universe ended. Anyway, because it disconnects the vast majority of your mass from the outside world, it's the perfect inertial dampener." Victor shook his head. "Huh? Photonic?" Jake turned to him. "The photonic thing ties to Einstein's theory of relativity. Basically, it says that anything with zero mass, like a photon, will always travel at the speed of light." He gestured toward the vessel. "To the outside world, everything in the bubble, including the ship itself, has no apparent mass. You could accelerate it from 0 to 100 miles an hour in an instant." Jake flicked his finger. "As easily as thumping a party balloon, but inside you wouldn't even slosh your coffee." Vic nodded, accepting Jake's description with mute amazement. Another epiphany hit Jake. "So they must generate a separate artificial gravity field so they can stand on the floor. Otherwise the interior would be a bubble of weightlessness." "Yep." Tearing his eyes away from the lights, Jake studied the ship's bowl-shaped bottom. It flowed up into the horizontal central bridge about 8 feet above the ground. In 3 places, its skin stretched down to support the ship. He pointed at the legs. "I don't remember seeing these on the one we encountered." "They're retractable," Richard responded. "That metal looks permanently stretched to me." "Hang on," Richard said, stepping back to the computer terminal in front of the ship. After he had punched a few keys, the deep hum emanating from the ship changed frequency. "What's that hum?" Vic started to ask, but stopped as the ship began levitating a couple of feet above the floor. Aside from the subsonic drone, the ship sat in total silence. "That is awesome," Vic said. "It's weird to see something rise off the ground so quietly," Jake said. In a half-second, the protrusions silently retracted, leaving smooth skin as the ship continued to hover. Okay, quit showing off," Jake said to Richard after a few minutes. "I'm dying to see the inside of this thing." "All right," Richard said, feigning dejection. Jake held up both hands and laughed. "Well, I'm impressed." "And me too," Vic added. Richard smiled. "You're too easy." He typed more commands into the interface. "And for my next trick..." The legs noiselessly re-extended, and the humming ceased as the ship gently touched down. Overhead, the ethereal gravitophoton-generated lights evaporated. Richard finished up at the keyboard and rejoined them. "Close your mouths, boys." "Well, I was just thinking that was probably the smoothest landing I've ever seen you make. As I recall, the mechanics back in Afghanistan were always amazed your aircraft could still taxi after one of your typical landings." "Screw you," Richard said through a grin. Pointing at the ship, Jake asked, What happened to the one that crashed in Roswell? As far as we know, it was returned to them. The Argonians gave us this ship in the 80s as part of the integration program. We're allowed to learn from it and reverse engineer what we can. However, we're not allowed to take it apart. Can we get to the mechanism that generates the ring of lights without taking it apart? Jake asked. Nope. Well, in other words, no access to the drive technology. At least not yet, Vic said. Exactly. They want to keep us in our little corner of the galaxy for now, Richard said, and then clapped his hands. So, are you two ready for more? I thought you'd never ask, Jake said. Lieutenant Croft, do you remember where the exit was? When they dropped me off, I think the door was right about here, Vic said, stepping between two of the legs. As he did, an opening suddenly appeared in front of him. Jake heard a whisper of static like a charged sock pulled from a clinging towel. See what I was talking about? Vic said. Yep, Jake said. He stepped up for a closer inspection. From overhead, the opening stretched from a foot below the bulge and continued in front of them, ending where the flat bottom of the ship's belly formed a threshold. They stepped into the airlock, and the door resealed with the same static sound. A moment later, just as Vic had described, an opening appeared in the opposite wall. This way, ladies, Richard said, stepping through. Jake followed. Stepping into the large room beyond, he paused. What the hell? The room was too wide. They had entered at ground level where the circumference of the belly section was significantly smaller than the main body. This room looks like it's as wide as the whole ship. Vic nodded. You're right. I didn't notice that the other night. The airlock doubles as an elevator, Richard said. Well, yeah, but that means it moved 8 feet in less than a second. I didn't feel anything, Jake said. Richard smiled. It's amazing what a gravity drive can do for you. Cool, Vic said, nodding his head. Walking deeper into the ship, Richard continued. This is an ARG Scout and General Utility ship. Like the one you saw the other night, it's identical to the one that crashed near Roswell. They have several configurations, but this is the most common. Jake studied the interior. I see what you meant about the walls, Vic. They glowed softly. The ceiling, about 10 feet above the floor, left space for another room above, although Jake didn't see a way to get to it. Aside from the central meter-wide column running from floor to ceiling, he saw no other items or structures in the cabin. Where's the control panel I saw? Vic asked. Like the chair that supported you when the edification encoder kicked in? Edification encoder? Vic interrupted. Is that really what they call it? Loosely translated, yes, Richard said with an understanding nod. Then he said the Argonian word. Utilizing the Argonian language knowledge imparted by the encoder's edification, Jake thought it was the best translation, although it seemed a bit condescending. You get the feeling they're a little full of themselves, Jake said. Guess that's a hazard of ruling the galaxy, Richard replied with a shrug. That brought up a question Jake had been meaning to ask. I know they started the galactic government, but I thought General Tannehill said it's free and inclusive, treating all equally. Well, it is, but they are by far the most widespread and populous species. They hold more than half of the government seats. I guess that'll be good for us, too, in the long run, Vic said. Especially we military types, Richard added. Why's that? Jake asked. Like General Tannehill said, they do share power, but the Argonians kept the military to themselves. Apparently mixing crews with biologies requiring radically different gravitational and atmospheric environments is a bit more complicated than portrayed in the Star Wars universe. I imagine they don't fully trust other species with their advanced tech and weapon systems, Vic said. Jake nodded. That must rub some species wrong. I'm sure you're right, and it's probably another manifestation of that conceit, Richard said. Vic grimaced and ran fingers through his short red hair. Sounds like we have more briefings to attend. You know so much about them. Jake and I haven't even scratched the surface. What do you think we're doing here? Jake's eyebrows rose. What do you mean? You finished your base orientation. He pointed at the ship's floor. Tonight you begin your induction into the Galactic Integration Program. Jake and Vic exchanged excited looks. Richard laughed. "You look like a couple of schoolgirls." After a moment, he gestured ahead with his right hand. "Mind if I continue the tour?" "Please do," Jake said with a huge grin. Richard started walking across the wide room. "Back to your question about the control panel. When needed, equipment grows from the floor. If you're actively maneuvering the vessel, the control panel stays in place. Once you're cruising, the interior changes its configuration." He gestured toward an area that Jake took to be the back half of the vessel. "It converts this into a living area and the Argonian version of a kitchen." Turning forward, Richard stepped to an area halfway between the wall and the center column. Moving to join him, Jake froze mid-step, startled by sudden movement in his lower peripheral vision. Like a reversed and radically accelerated time-lapse video of a melting ice sculpture, a structure grew from the floor. "Holy shit," Jake whispered as it finished forming. He stepped closer. Matching Vic's description, a curving glass control panel topped it. Everything seemed straightforward. Oddly recognizable symbols denoted controls and system status. He smiled in amazement. "I can read the Argonian writing." Turning his attention to its metallic sides, he asked, "How does it grow from the floor?" "The Argonians are masters of nanotechnology. You're literally standing on an ocean of molecule-sized robots." Jake and Vic cast nervous glances at the floor, shifting from foot to foot, looking under their feet. "Don't worry, they play nice," Richard said. Then, with a sardonic grin, he chuckled ominously. "Y'all are gonna love the EVA suits." "EVA suits?" Vic asked nervously. Apparently tiring of Vic's constant trepidation, Richard gave Jake an exasperated look. He turned to face Vic. "We'll come back to that later, Lieutenant." Turning toward the console, he continued. "Anyway, there are several types of nanobots. They're able to do everything from forming structures to making complex electrical circuits. Each nanobot has as much computing power as a PC. The billions of them networked together form the ship's artificial intelligence, or AI. So this AI can recognize your intentions and provide what you need," Jake said. "For the most part, it also responds to Argonian voice commands. We think the Argonians have another way of communicating with it, but haven't been able to figure that one out yet." Richard ran his hand across the control panel and the ship activated. A large section of wall ahead seemed to vanish. Apparently, detecting no change, the workers walking past the 30-foot wide window didn't respond. Jake guessed the effect was like a one-way mirror. If the wall were indeed clear, the emission of the ship's internal light and energy would negate the efficacy of the ship's energy-absorbing skin. Jake hadn't heard or felt anything, but through the view outside he could see they had lifted a meter or two. He was about to mention it when the ship started moving toward the blast doors. Richard touched another section of the panel. "Groom Lake Tower, this is Turtle 1, over." Jake chuckled. "You call it the Turtle?" Richard nodded. "That's fitting." Richard looked over his shoulder. "Kinda says it all, doesn't it?" A voice sprang from the panel's surface. "Turtle 1, this is Groom Lake Tower. You are cleared as filed. Please report in position and ready for departure." "Groom Lake Tower, Turtle 1, will go," Richard said. Jake's heart raced in anticipation. "Are we doing what I think?" Vic made a show of displaying a fake yawn. "Been there, done that," although excited eyes betrayed his true feelings. Richard turned, offering Jake the controls. "Here you go, buddy. This'll be the easiest nickel flight you've ever had." Jake, adrenaline pumping, approached the control panel. "Considering this is the first spaceship I've ever flown, you better hope it's an easy transition." Pointing to a graspable, hand-shaped depression embedded in the panel, Richard stepped aside. "Just place your hand in there. It responds to forces in all three axes. Slide upward causes a slow rise. Left pressure moves us left, and so on. Twist it for yaw, and roll it for... well, you get the idea." Jake nodded his understanding. "Remember to relax. This ship's stability augmentation system perfectly adjusts for all external disturbances, like wind or turbulence. It's even better than our fighter's SAS. Basically, it's a point-and-go system. Easier to maneuver than a car, it can be operated by anyone, much less a steely-eyed combat fighter pilot such as yourself. He bowed with mock reverence. Hiking a thumb at Richard, Jake looked at Vic. I told you he was an excellent judge of pilot skills. Ignoring Jake, Victor turned a concerned face to Richard. Without training, what stops someone from screwing up so bad they can't recover? The ship's AI is smarter than any of our supercomputers. It won't allow the ship to collide with anything. It constantly surveys its surroundings, calculating velocities and trajectories for itself and near ships. Using all the data, the computer buffers or blocks inputs that would put the ship in danger. Studying the control panel, Jake nodded. So it takes over the controls if it thinks you're screwing up. Yep, but it can do a lot more than that. With a verbal command, this ship can fly itself out of this hangar, perform the departure, and complete the flight plan. It monitors our conversation and understands our intentions, just as well as a normal human would. Holy shit, Vic whispered. He looked around. Is it self-aware? Jake wondered the same thing. How do they know it won't wake up on the wrong side of the hangar one morning and decide it wants to go Terminator? I guess the Argonians saw the movie too, Richard said after laughing at Jake's reference. Because they programmed special algorithms that prevent it from becoming self-aware. The last thing they want is a computer this powerful and linked to the ship's controls to start thinking independently. As Richard finished, Jake surreptitiously tried to run the ship into the hangar wall, keeping the speed down in case Richard had overstated the ship's abilities. Anticipating an impact or a maneuver to avoid it, Jake gripped the control panel. Just when he thought the ship was going to hit the hangar wall, it came to an instant stop. Richard shook his head. You just had to test it, didn't you? Lieutenant Croft looked up, surprised. Wow, I didn't feel it stop. Me neither. Guess I should have expected that, Jake said, laughing and relaxing the death grip he had on the panel. Remember, the ship's gravity drive moves all molecules within the drive's sphere of influence, Jake and Vic finished in unison. Okay, I just wanted to make sure y'all were paying attention. Knowing it on an intellectual level is one thing, but experiencing the disconnect between sight and seat of the pants is amazing, Jake said. I know. Pretty cool, huh? Richard said, nodding. The effect is a perfect inertial damper. He raised his hands overhead like he was on a roller coaster. Standing right here, you can take G's that normally would kill you. Look, Ma, no hands, Vic said. Jake turned the ship away from the hangar wall and continued toward the lift. As they approached, the doors opened, revealing the large elevator already in position. He turned to Richard with a questioning look. Take her in, Richard said. When is it going to be my turn? Victor asked with mock impatience. Age before... Well, as a soulless ginger, you ain't all that easy on the eyes, so I guess we'll just say rank has its privileges, Jake said as he guided the ship into the lift. Vic flipped him off. Once they passed into the elevator, a holographic display of the ship and surrounding lift formed over the control panel. They watched the miniature version of the blast door slide closed behind them. Cool, Vic said, forgetting Jake's jibe. Jake nodded and pointed into the image. Is this where you saw the holographic brain? Yep. I was wondering how we'd see what was behind it, Jake said. He looked at the opaque rear wall. It's not like we have a rear-view mirror. As they ascended the shaft, the display updated their vertical position in real time. -150, -140, -130. However, he still felt no movement. Looking out, Vic walked to the clear wall. What's the plan? Are we just taking it up for a quick trip around the traffic pattern? Patience, Richard said. You'll see soon enough. Suddenly, the lift darkened. Inside the turtle, the hologram and the soft glow of the ship's interior walls provided the only illumination. Jake looked down. The altitude display read 000. Outside, the exterior door started to lift. Filling the entire width of the giant door's opening, A blue-black sliver of night grew vertically from the floor, like diamonds scattered across a black velvet-lined drawer sliding from a black cabinet. The rising door revealed a background of scintillating stars. Ending in sharp contrast against the black silhouette of the surrounding mountains, the stars seemed to hover within easy reach. Staring at the night sky, Jake ran his free hand along the side of the control panel. "Which one of those did you come from, girl?" He turned to Richard. "Can she travel faster than light?" "The gravity drive, as they call it, has been disabled. Like I said, they want to keep us in our corner of the galaxy, at least until we complete our integration." "How fast is it with the light drive disabled?" Vic asked. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Where's the fun for me if I spill all the beans up front?" "All in good time, Lieutenant." Jake moved the ship into the open and noticed a hint of flashing colors reflecting off the tarmac. Richard nodded toward the light. "There's a stealth mode that damps down the drive's gravitophoton emissions." Reaching around Jake, he toggled the command. Outside, the multicolored reflections faded. Richard pointed toward the mountains to the east. "We don't want the UFO groupies over at the little Ailey Inn to spot us." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Why not suppress the light all the time? It reduces the turtle's maneuverability, but usually you don't need both stealth and maneuverability at the same time." Jake nodded. "Makes sense. If you need maneuverability, it's probably because someone already knows you're there, someone you're trying to keep up with or get away from." "Exactly." Richard activated the comm panel. "Groom Tower, Turtle 1 is in position and ready for departure." "Roger, Turtle 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Contact Space Control passing flight level 9er. "Roger, Groom Tower. Turtle 1 cleared for departure." "Thanks, guys." Pulse racing, Jake stared at Richard. "Passing flight level 9er? You betcha. That's 99,900 feet. Yep, everything above 100,000 feet in Space Control's domain." Huge grins spread across Jake and Vic's faces. Jake turned to Victor with a hand held up for a high five. "Holy shit! We're going into space." "Hell yeah!" Vic shouted, smacking his hand. With a crooked grin, Richard shook his head. "Amateurs." Jake scoffed. "Yeah, right, asshole." Elbowing Victor while pointing to Richard, he said, "Sandy and I went to flight school with this guy. I'll bet $1 to a donut that the first time he went up, his silly ass was standing right there giggling like a schoolgirl." "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard said, feigning innocence. Bringing them back on subject, he changed to a serious tone. "We're back to mission, boys. We're cleared for takeoff." Their smiles evaporated and they both nodded. "Jake, I want you to take us off vertically for the first 5 seconds, like an elevator, then pull the nose straight up." Looking back at the rear wall, 25 feet behind them, Jake imagined falling backward when he turned the nose up. Seeing this, Richard said, "Let me have the controls for a moment." Jake stepped right. "You have the controls, Captain." With Vic on the left, Richard moved to stand between them. Placing his hand on the controller, he said, "Roger, I have the controls." Without warning, he flipped the ship upside down. "Shit!" Jake screamed. He and Vic clutched at the edges of the control panel. He hadn't felt any movement, but the visual disorientation of seeing the horizon flip so quickly was overwhelming. Richard started laughing. "Don't worry, I had the same reaction." With a discomfited chuckle, Jake eased his death grip on the control panel. Looking up at the runway, 10 feet overhead, he said, "Standing outside looking in, we'd look like bats hanging in here by our feet." Looking irritated, Vic said, "Any chance we can get a heads up next time?" "Nope," Richard said, stepping back, gesturing to Jake. "You can have the controls, Captain." Stepping back into position, he said, "I have the controls." Gripping the control pad, he slowly turned the ship upright. "Chicken," Richard chided. Jake turned, facing him eye to eye. Without looking away, he snapped his hand to the right. The ship executed a perfect snap roll through the 360 degrees, stopping instantly once level. To his delight, a moment of disoriented concern flashed across Richard's face. "Gotcha," Jake said. "Damn it!" Vic yelled, Cut that crap out! Regaining his composure, Richard continued. Now that we've gotten that bit of training out of the way, are you ready for takeoff? Jake and Vic looked at each other. A mixture of anxiety, excitement, and apprehension was evident in Vic's face. Jake felt some of the same emotions crossing his. Let's do it, he said, facing forward. Make it so, number one, Richard said in a poor imitation of a British accent. Jake gripped the control pad and pulled up. The world outside blurred. Chapter 12. From the captain chair of his command ship, Helm Warden, Admiral Ashtara Takema surveyed his fleet through the vessel's broad view wall. Utilizing the display's pan and zoom features, he studied each silhouette. Light-absorbing skin rendered the Armada's huge battle cruisers and carriers as black voids drifting across the crisp starfield. In the expansive bridge, a floating holographic version of the fleet surrounded his elevated perch. The green holograms lent the dark silhouettes a third dimension. The ancient fleet was the culmination of technologies accumulated over the uncountable millennia since Argonians first ventured into the Great Vacuum. The Admiral shifted his gaze to the brilliant bulge of the galactic core. Without the obscuring dust, its billions of stars were clearly visible from the fleet's current inclination and proximity. On nearby habitable planets, the core was often visible during the day. Seeing the center third of the spiral-armed galaxy brought out Takema's inner anthropologist. Unlike the earthbound Argonians, inhabitants of planets in this sector would never refer to the bright blue stripe dominating their sky with a moniker as inane as Milkyway. The backstory to the name of his command ship, Helm Warden, still fascinated Takema, even though he'd been alive long enough to have witnessed a not insignificant percentage of its multimillennial history. It was more mission statement than title. Since ancient times, Argonians had called the galaxy the Helm, an archaic mariner term for wheel. Warden, meaning defender, gave the name its full meaning, galactic defender. Staring into the brilliant core with a sardonic grin, Takema cocked an eyebrow. And the helm truly needs defending. He pushed the negative thought away. If only for a moment, he wanted to revel in rumination. Long ago, medical advancements coupled with a full understanding of DNA banished death by disease and old age. The ever-expanding population birthed by their virtual immortality had fueled the Argonians' drive to explore and populate the galaxy. It was during those early efforts that Argonians must have first populated Earth. Esoteric and tradition-based, the Argonian culture developed and matured over the subsequent millennia. While the Earthbound branch had somehow lost their technological roots, generation after generation of Argonians developed technologies and machines, each better and more advanced than its predecessor, each bringing societal and economic changes. Eventually, their culture and technological achievements plateaued. Further advances had required the Argonians to grow beyond their mortal bodies. To take advantage of the expanded mentality afforded by the virtual world and the rich textures and unpredictability of the real world, as well as to buffer themselves against unplanned terminations arising from accidents or warfare, most Argonians experienced a parallel existence. Simultaneously, they lived within the digital realm and the organic. In order to maintain continuity of thought and self with their computer-based version on Argonia, each vessel or community maintained a real-time data link utilizing a zero-width, one-dimensional communications wormhole. Exceeding the speed of synaptic-based thought, the transgalactic data transfer rates seamlessly connected the organic brain to the computer-based, just as the corpus callosum connected the two hemispheres of the brain, rendering the parallel existence as one. Unless you sought the boundaries, you couldn't sense where one ended and the other began. Originally, Argonians had uploaded themselves as copies, maintaining their sense of self within the organic body. Over the intervening centuries and millennia, the thoughts, memories, and life experiences stemming from their computer-based reality far surpassed their corporeal existence. Now, most Argonians consider the organic half of their existence as an extension of their essence, not the home of it. Leaning back in his chair on the Helm Warden's bridge, Ashtara took a moment to enjoy his surroundings. Throughout the ship, naturally antiqued metal decorated every surface. Over the millennia, the metallic alloy had taken on a dark bronze tint. While not as big as the ship's largest halls, the bridge had a respectable 10-meter ceiling. Tall, pointed arches marked the 3 corridors entering the bridge. Shifting his gaze to the ceiling, he surveyed the cube-shaped room's upper 4 corners. Large metallic sculptures of predatory birds pointed toward the bridge's center. The artist rendered each frozen in full dive, wings pinned back, talons outstretched, and carnivorous beaks thrust into the onrushing wind. Across a multitude of species and cultures, galactic history revealed a persistent theme. Once a society reached a plateau of wealth and technology, it switched to developing cultural richness, entering the age of legacy. In that epoch, projects of every type and scope aspired to eclipse mere function, endeavoring to maximize cultural wealth. The Galactic Defense Force's space fleet was a pure manifestation of this legacy, every ship a massive floating cathedral to prosperity, art, technology, and life. Each as ornately decorated as they were functional, the vessels were replete with cavernous halls. Their ceilings towered 50 meters overhead. Elaborate passageways decorated with towering 25-meter bronze arches connected the ship's various sections. Interspersed throughout, elegant and ancient botanical gardens gave the ships a regal air. Cultural studies were Admiral Takema's passion. The similarities between races separated by millennia and light years fascinated him. His studies of the closely guarded secret of the earthbound Argonians, the lost colony, revealed amazing parallels between their development and Argonia's ancient history. Earth's society, evolving in complete isolation, employed many of the same traditions and governmental organizations as the Argonians. Even the military organizations had separately evolved a synchronicity of traditions and command structures. Earth's history was replete with Age of Legacy examples. The early Egyptians' pyramids, the Roman Empire's Colosseum, followed by the rise of the Roman Catholic Church and its Vatican. Earth was now in the disposable age, a time when a society repeatedly finds yesterday's new technologies and materials rendered obsolete by the relentless march of discovery. Out of necessity and the expectation that whatever they build today will be worthless tomorrow, little, beyond minimal artistic appeal and bare essential engineering, is invested in projects. Having exhausted all the time the current situation afforded for an old man's reminiscing, Admiral Takema shook off the thoughts and stood. He ran fingers through his wavy, permanently salt and pepper hair. With an apparent age in his mid-40s, the Admiral had a dignified air. While Argonian medical technology allowed him to maintain any apparent age, he felt this one best represented his inner self. Turning his gaze from the view wall, he studied the bridge. The command level's elevated floor was a transparent, permanently stable force field that placed the observer in the center of a room-filling 3-dimensional holographic display. Computer-generated representations of the vessels and planetary bodies in the Helm Warden's vicinity filled the bridge. In every direction the Admiral looked, holograms of the fleet's ships flew in formation with the Helm Warden. The size of each vessel was exaggerated. The fleet's formation spanned several light seconds of space. If rendered at true scale, the massive ships would be little more than tiny specks. Slowly passing through one of the birds of prey in the bridge's upper corner, a hologram of the planet they were departing was drifting out of view, its curving surface receding into the ceiling. The permanent force field floor was augmented with on-demand features. For instance, if you want to sit, you simply lean back and the field adjusted to support you. To leave the elevated pedestal, walk to the edge marked by a softly glowing yellow line and step over. A gravity lift then gently lowered you to the bridge's bottom level. Finishing his survey, the Admiral watched as one of his senior corps commanders rose to the pedestal bridge. Standing at attention after landing on the clear floor, the commander saluted. "Admiral Takema, I've received an unusual report regarding the Zoxith. Forward it to my Eon, ordered the Admiral as he dropped into his force field-generated captain's chair. After a brief pause, the commander said, "You have the file now, sir." The Admiral accessed his Eon. After a quick scan, he cocked an eyebrow. "This doesn't make sense." "My thoughts too, sir. They never send dreadnoughts away from the action. And such a large force." "Yes, sir. Dividing their military like this is pure folly. This may be our opportunity to bring the war to a close." Admiral Takema went through the various possible scenarios. He couldn't understand why they would send a force of that size into that sector. Far removed from the main shipping routes, the area in that direction offered nothing of strategic importance. Utilizing his Eon, he accessed the bridge's hologram. The rendered fleet and planetary body dissolved into a swirling storm of disassociated pixels. After a moment, the vortex of light coalesced into an animation of the Helm Galaxy, or the Milky Way, as the earthbound Argonians would call it. "Show the last known position of all Zoxith military ships." A tight grouping of red icons popped into existence about a third of the way out from the galactic core. A second grouping appeared less than halfway out from the center. In the relatively empty space between the spiral bands, the second grouping of ships appeared to be crossing to the adjacent galactic arm. Subvocalizing through his Eon interface, he commanded the display to draw a line from the enemy's main fleet to the reported position of the other ships. Connecting to the two groups, a red line crossed an appreciable portion of the galaxy's radius. "Extend the line to the galactic perimeter." As the red line lengthened, it penetrated the adjacent spiraled arm about mid-span. Takema studied the area with growing concern and mounting unease. "Superimpose sector numbers." His heart skipped a beat when he saw the line passing through the 60 series. "No," he whispered. "They can't know." Hell, even his commanders didn't know of their existence. Subvocalizing, he ordered the display to zoom in on Sector 64. To his horror, the red line cut through the center of a solar system with a very familiar G-type main sequence star. "Oh, lords!" exclaimed the Admiral, standing as a sinking feeling struck his gut. "Deploy 3rd Carrier Group and 3 attack squadrons to Sector 64 immediately." "I don't understand, sir. The Zoxith only attack Argonian systems. There are none in that sector." Ignoring the commander, he said, "Tell Admiral Thoyd Fadiak he'll have his deployment orders once they're underway. Have all other commanders report to the briefing arena in 1 hour. If they can't be there, their holograms had better be." "Yes, sir," the commander said. Wondering how they knew, hoping he was wrong, but knowing he wasn't, Admiral Takema monitored the orders cycling through his Eon. "Gods, please let Thoyd get there in time." Chapter 13. The outside world blurred the instant Jake applied upward pressure on the flight controller. As if it anticipated his intentions, the ship rocketed up like a homesick heavenly elevator almost before he commanded it. The artificial intelligence's instantaneous interpretation of his rapid input made the AI seem prescient. The ship lifted so quickly, Jake's knees buckled under the visually perceived G-forces. He saw Vic respond the same. While Jake had felt no acceleration, the visual input through the view wall convinced his mind, tripping the instinctive response. The scene outside was astounding. Under shocking acceleration, the airfield and then the surrounding mountains rapidly shrank below their line of sight. Looking up at the brightening stars, Jake applied slight back pressure to the controls. The ship responded by gently pitching up. Continuing to apply accelerative pressure on the flight controller, he ushered the ship upward, nose first. Like a swimmer coming up from the depths, the ship broke free of the planet's ocean of air. Shining in more colors than he imagined possible, Stars morphed from soft, twinkling lights to crisp points. Jake had never seen pictures, videos, or even cinematic special effects that approached the level of beauty he was witnessing. "Now neutralize all pressure," Richard said, pointing at the controller. Jake slowly relaxed his hand. From this altitude, unknown miles above the planet's surface, with only stars filling the view wall, nothing seemed to change. Applying a slight forward pressure on the controller, the stars slid up as the ship pitched forward. His heart soared as an incredible sunset rose into view. With the beautiful panorama filling the view wall, he released the controller, freezing the scene. Watching the day's second sunset from an apparent altitude of 100 miles above North America's west coast, the three officers stared in silent reverence. Peeking over the distant horizon, the sun's beautiful rays streaked across the Pacific Ocean. The golden river of light flowed around towering cumulus clouds. Like fingers in the stream, their long shadows stretched into the east's encroaching darkness. "I can't believe I'm here. Wish you could have seen this, Dad," he thought, sending a prayer to his deceased father. It was he who had nurtured Jake's love of aviation. Ron Giard had taken his son to countless air shows and space shuttle launches. Jake could still see the awe in his father's eyes at the first launch they had attended. Jake had found it infectious and ultimately irresistible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere flashed with golden brilliance, its thin, life-supporting blanket glowing brighter than the underlying surface. A few poignant moments later, they turned away from the panorama. Stifling sniffs, they coughed, looking anywhere but at each other. "Let's not hang at this altitude too long," Richard said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Even the light-absorbing skin can't soak up this much sunlight. We might be visible." Richard pointed at something beyond the view wall's right side. "Why don't you take us over there?" Following Richard's gaze, Jake grabbed the controller. As he rotated the turtle eastward, a half-lit orb slid into view at the far right end of the ship-spanning panoramic display. Victor drew a sharp breath. A huge smile spread across Jake's face. The moon? Visible along the left side of the view wall, Earth's night-darkened, curved horizon spanned from floor to ceiling. Much smaller, only occupying a small portion of the vertical field, the first quarter or half moon hung near the right side of the panorama. Without answering, Richard stepped next to Jake. He toggled a command into the panel's interface, and a glowing three-dimensional model of their ship coalesced at eye level. Sticking his thumb and forefinger into the holographic turtle and spreading them apart, Richard magnified the display. Repeating the movement, spreading his fingers apart as you would on a smartphone, caused the rendered ship to grow in size and detail. Vic looked duly impressed. "They didn't use it like that last time." "I'm just demonstrating its capabilities," Richard said, as the ship grew to fill the space available. Not interested in the large virtual model of the turtle, Jake walked to the view wall. The illuminated right side of the moon was blindingly bright. Without the dulling effect of the atmosphere, craters and mountains stood in stark relief. Dragging his eyes from the incredible scene, Jake turned back to his wingman. He looked through the translucent computer-generated ship at Richard and Vic's hologram-illuminated green faces. The moon? Still ignoring him, Richard slid his open hand into the hologram. This time he pinched his fingers together. As it would on a smartphone, the gesture reversed the magnification process. The faster he made the movement, the farther the display zoomed out. A couple of gestures later, the turtle shrank to a tiny point of light as Earth's curved surface slid into the bottom of the scene. A particulate haze floated over the planet's arcing surface. Following curved paths, pixels of light seemed to drift in every direction. Jake pointed. "Satellites?" Richard nodded. "There's so many of them," Vic said. Bending over, he lowered his face into the display. Tiny green dots appeared to pass in and out of his head. With childlike, wide-eyed amazement, Victor watched them zip about like a swarm of flies. Impatient and apparently irritated, Richard elbowed the young lieutenant out of the display. Grinning, he winked at Jake. "The moon?" Jake persisted. Richard's grin morphed into a frown. Spreading his arms apart like he was trying to grab a large beach ball, he reached into the hologram. "Watch this." He brought his hands together. The image quickly zoomed out, Earth shrinking while the comparatively small moon slid into view. "And now for my next trick," Richard said. He walked to the miniature moon. With his face mere inches from the glowing sphere, Richard raised his right hand. After a dramatic pause, he extended his index finger and poked the cratered surface. Ripples and a loud pop emanated from the point of Richard's touch. Moving like pond water disturbed by a tossed pebble, the surface undulated as concentric rings radiated across the virtual moon. After toggling another command into the control panel, Richard leaned back. A chair rose from the floor, smoothly capturing his falling physique. Reclining, he laced fingers behind his head. "That's it." "What's it?" Vic asked. "We're on our way," Richard said, pulling a hand from behind his head and pointing through the view wall. Jake turned to see Earth's horizon sliding out of sight as the moon moved to the center of the star-filled panorama. The ship was starting the 225,000-mile journey. Shocked and trembling with adrenaline, Jake surrendered to the ship's gravity field and plopped down next to Richard. He mouthed a silent thank you when a chair rose to support him. Speechless, Vic did the same. "This is amazing," Jake whispered. He patted Richard on the shoulder. "Buddy, I have to admit I didn't see this coming. Ever." Leaning closer, he asked, "Are we going to land?" "No, our flight plan doesn't allow for that. Speaking of," Richard leaned forward and toggled the comm panel. "Space Control, this is Turtle 1, over. Turtle 1, this is Space Control. Radar contact. Report lunar orbital insertion. Roger, Control. Talk to you in a few minutes." "A few minutes?" Jake asked. "There's no way we—" His protest died mid-sentence as he looked outside. The moon now filled half the view wall. In the few minutes they'd been underway, the moon's apparent size had quadrupled. Crisper and clearer than any picture, the vision of its cratered surface, along with the stark contrast of the ancient lava seas lapping against their ringing mountain ranges, left him breathless. Again, he sat in shocked silence. Their ship closed at such tremendous velocity that the moon grew visibly while Jake studied the scene. Unable to tear his eyes from the incredible sight, Jake tapped Richard's arm. "How fast is this thing? The Apollo missions took days. I figured the Turtle would be faster, but this—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "We could explore the solar system with this thing," Vic said in an awed tone. Richard gave him a meaningful glance. "What makes you think we haven't?" He turned to Jake. "Not so fast you could reasonably travel to the stars without the light drive capability, but it has opened the solar system to us." Self-consciously closing his gaping mouth, Jake nodded. Studying the moon's nearing surface, he saw craters within craters within craters. "This is so cool." When the moon expanded to fill the entire view wall, he saw their speed drop dramatically. Traversing its surface from west to east, the Turtle entered a counterclockwise orbit around the moon. Richard activated the comm panel. "Space Control, Turtle 1 entered orbit at 0630 hours Zulu." Jake checked his watch. While it was 10:30 p.m. back home, in Greenwich, England, it was 6:30 a.m., or half six, as the Brits called it. The thought triggered an idea. Shooting to his feet, he turned to Richard. "Hey, can you turn the ship toward Earth?" "Yeah, but you won't be able to see it much longer. We'll be passing behind the moon soon." "Exactly. That's what I want to see." Smiling, Richard nodded. He grabbed the control pad with one hand and actuated the comm panel with the other. "Control, we're about to pass out of radio range. We'll talk to you on the other side." "Roger, Turtle 1, catch you in 45. Responding to Richard's inputs, the ship began to rotate about its vertical axis. It transitioned from facing east to north and then to west. As they flew backward toward the moon's far side, the desolate surface slid away below them. Moving closer to the view wall, standing three abreast, they watched Buzz Aldrin's splendid desolation spool out under their feet. Earth's vibrant globe loomed large over the monochromatic, cratered horizon. North America, barely discernible by its city lights, shone from the dark side. Farther east, across the Atlantic, the sunlit side formed a beautiful crescent, Europe and the islands of Great Britain visible as they greeted the morning sun. Continuing their mute vigil, they watched as Earth touched the moon's horizon. In an existential moment, Jake considered how fragile and insignificant their home looked. Raising his outstretched arm, he bracketed Earth with his thumb and forefinger. "All of mankind lives on that little rock," he said, breaking the silence. One eye closed, he watched the pinched world slowly slip behind the moon. Then it was gone. Chapter 14. From the bridge of the newly renamed flagship Forebearer's Revenge, Commodore Saleth watched his fleet of dreadnoughts plow through the interstellar void. Looking ahead of the formation, he studied the relativistically compressed multicolored spherical star field. The fleet's faster-than-light speed squeezed the incoming photons streaming from the stars abeam and forward of the fleet into a fish-eyed cluster of light. Within the glowing ball, concentric rings of color surrounded a blindingly brilliant point. From its ultraviolet center, the visible spectrum of light shifted through the full rainbow of colors, finally fading into a red-shifted outer ring. At the perimeter of the visible light lay a razor-thin infrared ring. Saleth's heat-sensitive reptilian eyes could just detect it against the absolute cold that was the universe outside that sphere. The rest was a virtual black hole, the light from stars behind them unable to catch up with the fleet's superluminal velocity. Parallel space outside the central ball of stars was so completely devoid of light that it wasn't difficult to imagine it the domain of innumerable and unimaginable evils. It was a place in which Saleth, and Zoxith in general, felt at home. He imagined the ancient forebearers staring back at him from that dark Valhalla. Saleth glowered into the abyss. "Today, I bring your vengeance to the enemy." Pivoting with a grace belying his massive bulk, he turned and stomped back to his cathedra. The enormous stone throne was the same size as the one that dominated the bridge of Lord Thrax's command ship Tador Droff. Because of his superior genetics, Saleth was the largest Zoxith specimen in his fleet. However, as the spacious accommodations of this seat of power demonstrated all too well, he still hadn't attained the domineering mass of Lord Thrax. Glancing self-consciously at the large gaps between his leg scales and the cathedra's sides, Saleth stood. After a quick scan of the bridge personnel revealed no appraising stares, Saleth marched to the communications console. Knocking aside the officer standing over it, the Commodore activated a fleet-wide call. "All ships, drop out of parallel space at the designated space-time coordinates and proceed to your pre-assigned attack positions." Moments after receiving Saleth's order, the fleet dropped back into real space. The Commodore stomped to the forward viewport. Ahead, half a universe worth of stars exploded from the fisheye. As the light streaming from the stars astern joined the photons from ahead, the star field fully encircled the formation of ships. Glaring through the port, Saleth studied the water-rich world that had blossomed ahead of his fleet. The celestial body hovered where the ball of stars had been a moment earlier. The planet filled the Forebearer's Retribution's viewport. Saleth scanned the visible continents. Greeting its final sunrise, their ship's initial target lay clearly visible along the day-night terminator. The light-loving mammals were in for a rude awakening. Radars of varying bandwidths painted all 16 of his ships within moments of their arrival. Some originated from the multitude of orbiting machines surrounding the blue planet. Saleth drew his sharp, scaly lips back in a fearsome snarl. "Look at us all you want. It will make no difference. Soon Lord Thrax will know he chose wisely." Turning, he faced the assembled officers. Silhouetted against the blue, brown, and green sphere, he lifted two clenched fists. "Now the Argonians will truly know the pain and fury of the Forebearers." Chapter 15. Jake's position, inches from the view wall, afforded a beautiful panorama. Richard had rotated the turtle back to the east. Facing forward, the ship glided 10 miles above the moon's barren surface in graceful silence. More cratered than the familiar near side, this half didn't have the gravitational umbrella of Earth hovering permanently overhead. Looking down, he watched as pockmarked proof passed intransigently under the turtle. Lieutenant Croft turned toward Jake with an excited expression. "We might be able to see a lunar lander from this altitude. Definitely if we're a little lower." He turned to Richard. "Can we visit one of the Apollo landing sites?" Richard considered it for a moment, then nodded. "There's one not too far from where we'll emerge from the far side. I think we have time for a flyby. We'll have to change our flight plan when we contact control." He paused to check his watch. "In 35 minutes. Jake and Victor exchanged glances. "Too bad we don't have time for a landing," Jake said with a meaningful look. "Good try, buddy. It wouldn't matter how much time we had. We could never land there. They're designated as historical sites, and we have strict orders not to go there." After a moment, Jake and Victor nodded. "Guess they don't want us trudging through Neil Armstrong's historic footprints," Jake said. "Cheer up, boys. Like I said, we'll still do a low pass. In the meantime, are you ready to see the rest of the ship?" "Upstairs?" Jake asked. "Yep." Scanning the interior, Jake didn't see an obvious way to the upper floor. The room had no stairs or openings, although considering how they had passed through walls to enter the ship, he knew the latter wasn't a problem. Apparently reading the confusion on his face, Richard held up a finger. "Guess it would be easier to show you than to explain." He turned and walked toward the center column of the ship. A green, meter-wide glowing ring appeared on the floor. Reaching the circle, Richard stepped into it. After 2 seconds, his feet left the floor as an invisible force lifted him toward the ceiling. An instant before Richard smacked headlong into the solid ceiling, a familiar crackling static sound echoed through the ship. An opening with the same diameter as the lower ring appeared in its smooth surface, and Richard disappeared through it. "Come on up." Jake and Victor looked through the view wall at the scrolling terrain. Reluctantly, they pried themselves away from the incredible scene. Richard's voice drifted through the overhead opening. "Don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. We'll be on the far side for a few more minutes. Besides, this side is pretty boring anyway." "Boring," Jake said. "That's the last thing I'd call it. Jaded much?" Ahead of him, Victor hesitated at the ring's perimeter. "Any time now, ladies." Tentatively, Victor extended a probing boot into the circle. Impatient, Jake gave him a shove. "Let's go, Lieutenant." Stumbling into the halo, Victor looked at him with an apparent protest forming on his lips. Before he could speak, Vic's eyes widened, and he looked down. Then he lifted from the floor. Jake stepped into the glowing ring. At first, nothing happened. Then he felt an invisible force encase his lower legs, and he rose from the floor. "It grabs your legs to keep you lined up with the opening," Richard said. Overhead, Vic reached the top and slid sideways. Jake saw Richard perched on the edge of the opening. The lift gently deposited Victor on the floor next to him. As Jake passed through the gap, the propelling force shifted him sideward and set him next to Richard opposite Victor. Faint static noise came from the hole as the floor solidified. Another glowing green ring marked its prior location. Slightly smaller in diameter than the lower room, the width of the upper compartment correlated to the narrower upper section of the exterior. The ship's central column terminated about 4 feet above the deck. As Richard walked toward it, Jake noticed some familiar controls in the upper surface of the pedestal. While not as complete as the set on the bridge, they apparently facilitated flying the ship from this level. "Why did they put a set of controls up here?" Jake asked. "You can't see out." With a practiced dramatic flourish, Richard lifted both arms. Raising his voice, he spoke with the exaggerated inflections of a magician introducing his next illusion. "This room serves many purposes." With an arcing sweep of his right arm, Richard reached down and activated a control. Jake's heart leapt as the top half of the ship vanished. Involuntarily, he stopped breathing. Appearing to expose the floor, pedestal, and 3 officers to open space, the entire circumference of the wall and ceiling disappeared. Once he realized they hadn't plunged into vacuum and weren't dead, he turned and glared at a laughing Richard. "That never gets old. You can breathe now." Jake slugged his shoulder. "A little warning next time." Turning, Jake inspected the full 360 degrees. The moon's horizon was equally visible in every direction. It looked like they were standing on a round platform suspended over an ancient alien desert. Ahead, in the direction of flight, lay the day-night Terminator. The line where lengthening shadows gave way to a 14-day-long lunar night drew closer every second. "Let me try something," Victor said as he stepped up to the center column. Richard nodded. Placing his hand into the controller, Victor pitched the ship forward, turning the floor perpendicular to the moonscape. Then he stepped around the column and walked to the edge closest to the moon's cascading surface. Richard cast a questioning look at Jake. Jake gave him an Area 51 salute. With his back turned toward them, Victor raised both arms overhead, fingers extended like a plunging diver. Looking up, he stared in the direction of flight. Finally realizing what he was doing, the other two moved to stand on either side and did the same. With the turtle's bulk blocking them from the setting sun, only the faltering light reflecting off the moon's undulating surface illuminated their laughing faces. Side by side, with arms extended and heads tilted back, they flew across the moon's cratered surface like 3 superheroes flying in formation. As the ship slid into shadow, the moment passed. They lowered their arms and wiped away tears of laughter. "If we're still laughing like that when Space Control calls, they'll figure we've gone off the deep end," Richard said. He actuated the controls and the walls shifted back to opaque. "Want to see the EVA suits?" "EVA suits," Vic said. His face brightened with nervous excitement. "Space suits?" Jake looked around. "Where are they? No, wait, let me guess. In the floor?" Richard held up a finger. "Watch and learn." With his other hand, he actuated another portion of the control panel. Midway between the central pedestal and the rear wall, a semicircle of cabinets grew from the floor. "How in the hell does that work?" Jake asked. "It's all about nanotechnology." Jake pointed at the freshly formed 6-foot-tall cabinets. "I know, but even considering that, how did they get this much material from a floor no more than 2 inches thick?" "Carbon nanotubes, the same matter in carbon composites, except instead of being arranged in sheets, the molecules roll into tubes 1 carbon atom wide. They're strong enough that if you put together enough of them to equal the thickness of a human hair, that tiny thread could easily lift the weight of a full tractor trailer." "How do the nanites use the nanotubes? Are they made of it or do they use it?" "Both. Their internal structures are made from it, but they live in an ocean of the stuff." Jake tilted his head. "So they're like spiders with a virtually endless supply of super strong silk?" Richard nodded. "Exactly." Victor froze. "Spiders?" Ignoring him, Jake did a quick cabinet count. "Looks like it's equipped for up to 10 personnel." "Yep," he replied, checking his wristwatch. "But since we're coming up on Earthrise, I'll have to show you how they work later. Let's head down." Spiders?" Victor asked again. Richard shook his head and activated the control. The cabinets melted back into the floor. He gestured to the glowing green ring. "Gentlemen?" Vic relented and stepped tentatively into the ring, jumping noticeably when it started down. "Skittish, that one," Richard said under his breath, nodding toward Lieutenant Croft. "Yeah, he's smart enough, but a little insecure at times," Jake agreed. He stepped into position and started down. Richard followed. Back at the control panel, Richard pitched the ship up, returning it to level. On cue, Earth began to peak above the moon's night-darkened limb. A loud klaxon rang through the ship. The wall's soft glow shifted to dark red. Jake's suddenly flowing adrenaline ratcheted up another notch as the turtle self-actuated its holographic display. One glance at Richard told him this was an unprecedented development. 5 feet beyond the console, the rendered Earth coalesced with its familiar swarm of green satellites. At the same time, A holographic moon formed between Jake and Richard. Centered over the console and pulsing with an ominous red hue, a formation of indiscernible objects hung between the moon and Earth. Where the hell did those come from?
That's the end of part 1, but there's 2 more parts. So be sure to click this link right here and head on to Ambush Part 2.
Print copyright 2014, Dean M. Cole. Audio production copyright 2019, Dean M. Cole. All rights reserved.